The fire in the Gryffindor common room had burned down to a comfortable glow, casting dancing shadows across the worn carpet and overstuffed armchairs. Outside the tall windows, November rain pelted against the glass, but inside, the warmth wrapped around the remaining students like an invisible blanket. Most of Gryffindor Tower had retreated to their dormitories hours ago, but a dedicated few fifth years remained scattered about, hunched over essays and textbooks with the desperate focus of students who'd left everything to the last possible moment. Lavender Patil sat cross-legged on the hearthrug, her divination homework spread before her in a chaotic semicircle of parchment, tea leaves, and a crystal ball that kept rolling away whenever she wasn't looking. Across from her, Dean Thomas had commandeered an entire sofa, his transfiguration notes competing for space with half-finished sketches of the Hogwarts grounds. In the corner nearest the boys' staircase, Seamus Finnegan was practicing wand movements for charms, his lips moving silently as he traced patterns in the air, occasionally producing small showers of gold sparks that made Lavender look up and glare. The common room held that particular quality of late-night silence, not truly quiet, but filled with the gentle sounds of a space settling into rest. The fire crackled and popped. Quills scratched against parchment. The portraits on the walls snored softly, their painted chests rising and falling in exaggerated sleep. Even the usual creaks and groans of the castle seemed muted, as though Hogwarts itself had decided to let its students work in peace. Then the portrait hole swung open with a creak that seemed far too loud in the stillness. Fred Weasley stepped through first, his hair plastered to his forehead with rain, water dripping from his robes onto the stone threshold. George followed, immediately behind, equally soaked, and both twins wore expressions of such studied innocence that Dean looked up from his notes with immediate suspicion. "Evening all," Fred announced cheerfully, tracking wet footprints across the carpet as he made his way toward the fire. "Lovely night for a stroll, wouldn't you say, George?" "Absolutely lovely," George agreed, wringing water from his sleeve with exaggerated care. "Very refreshing. Cleared the head remarkably well." Lavender narrowed her eyes at them. "It's past 11. Where have you been?" "Out," Fred said. "About," George added. "Definitely not in the third-floor corridor near that abandoned arithmancy classroom," Fred continued. "The one that nobody uses anymore because it smells like old socks and despair," George clarified. "We were absolutely, certainly, definitely not there." Fred finished with a grin. The fifth years exchanged glances. When the Weasley twins spoke in tandem like that, it usually meant something interesting, or potentially dangerous, was about to happen. Seamus abandoned his charms practice and drifted closer, his curiosity overcoming his determination to finally master the summoning charm. "What's in your pockets?" Dean asked, pointing with his quill. "They're humming." It was true. Now that they were closer to the firelight, a faint sound emanated from the depths of the twins' robes, a soft, melodic humming that seemed to rise and fall in gentle waves. And unless the firelight was playing tricks, there was definitely a glow coming from Fred's left pocket, a pale blue shimmer that pulsed in time with the humming. "Nothing dangerous," Fred said, which had never once in the history of Hogwarts been a reassuring statement when coming from a Weasley twin. "Mostly harmless," George amended. "Entirely festive," Fred added. "Festive?" Lavender repeated. "It's November." Never too early for Christmas spirit, George said solemnly. That's what our mum always says. Well, she says it's starting in September, actually. She's already knitted everyone's jumpers for this year. Mine has a hippogriff on it. It looks more like a demented chicken, but it's the thought that counts. Fred had moved to the center of the common room now, looking around with the assessing gaze of someone planning something. George joined him, and they stood back to back for a moment, surveying their surroundings, like military commanders planning a campaign. The remaining students watched with a mixture of wariness and anticipation. On the wall above the fireplace, the portrait that usually held a sleeping witch in medieval robes had been replaced sometime last week with a severe-looking wizard in tartan robes. The nameplate read, Tobias McGregor, Headmaster, 1692, 1703. And unlike most of the portraits in the common room, this one hadn't yet learned to pretend to be asleep when students were doing things they shouldn't. His painted eyes followed Fred and George with distinct suspicion. You two, McGregor said, his Scottish accent thick even through the canvas, are up to something. Us? Fred pressed a hand to his chest in mock offense. We're the picture of responsible behavior. We're practically prefects, George added. Our dear brother Percy would be so proud, Fred said. If he weren't in London being importantly ministerial, George finished. McGregor harumphed, but said nothing more, though his painted eyebrows drew together in a skeptical line. Below his portrait, McGonagall's personal frame, the one that connected to her office, remained empty. She was likely still in her quarters, grading papers or perhaps enjoying a rare hour of peace with a book and a cup of tea. The twins glanced at the empty frame and seemed to relax slightly. Right then, Fred said, reaching into his pocket with the careful movements of someone handling something delicate. We've been working on a little project. A bit of experimental magic, George said, mirroring his brother's movements. Nothing in the curriculum, obviously, Fred continued. Far too creative for that, George agreed. Too fun, Fred said. Too festive, George added. From their pockets, they withdrew what appeared at first glance to be nothing more than small glass vials, the kind used in potions class to store ingredients. But as they held them up to the firelight, the contents became visible. Each vial contained what looked like a single snowflake, impossibly preserved, glowing with that same soft blue light and definitely, unmistakably humming. Lavender gasped. Are those enchanted snow? Not just enchanted, Fred said, turning his vial slowly so the snowflake inside caught the light. These are singing snowflakes. Caroling snow, George corrected. Musical precipitation, Fred offered. Yuletide frozen water vapor with sonic enhancement, George said in his best impression of a pompous textbook. Dean had abandoned his homework entirely now and moved closer, squinting at the vials. How do they work? The twins exchanged one of their infamous looks, the kind of wordless communication that only people who'd shared a womb could truly master. Then they grinned in perfect synchronization. Like this, Fred said. With a practiced flick of his wand, he opened his vial. The snowflake drifted out, floating upward as though lifted by invisible currents. It was larger than a natural snowflake, about the size of a galleon, and intricate beyond belief. In the firelight, its crystalline structure caught and refracted the flames, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the common room walls. And it was definitely, absolutely, unmistakably humming. The snowflake drifted lazily through the air, spinning gently as it descended. Lavender watched it with wide eyes, unconsciously leaning back as it approached. When it finally landed, settling with impossible lightness on the open Transfiguration textbook beside her, the humming suddenly resolved into something clear and recognizable. "Deck the halls with boughs of holly," the snowflake sang in a voice like silver bells, perfectly pitched and impossibly cheerful. Fa la 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 la, la 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 la. For a moment, nobody moved. The snowflake continued its song, glowing softly on the page, illuminating illustrations of teacups transforming into tortoises. Then Seamus started laughing, a helpless, delighted sound that broke the spell of silence. "That's brilliant," he said, moving closer. "Absolutely brilliant. How did you—" "Trade secret," Fred said, but he was grinning so widely it looked almost painful. "Ancient Weasley family magic," George added. "Passed down through generations," Fred continued. "Well, invented last Tuesday," George admitted. "But it'll be passed down through generations starting now, won't it?" The portrait of Tobias McGregor was leaning forward in his frame, his painted face a mixture of disapproval and unwilling fascination. "In my day," he began, but whatever wisdom he'd been about to impart was lost as George released his snowflake as well. This one was slightly smaller, with a more complex, crystalline structure that caught the light differently, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change as it moved. It floated across the common room in a gentle spiral, heading directly for Dean, who held very still as it descended toward his head. When it landed, settling into his dark hair like a tiny, luminous crown, it began to sing in a different voice, this one deeper and warmer. "God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay," it crooned, and Dean's expression shifted from surprise to pure joy. "This is mad," Lavender breathed, but she was smiling, her divination homework forgotten. "This is absolutely mad. Do you have more?" The twins' grins somehow grew even wider. Fred reached into his other pocket, the one that definitely shouldn't have been able to hold what he pulled out. A cloth bag that clinked and chimed as he set it on the table, easily the size of a cauldron, despite having come from a pocket that couldn't have been more than a few inches deep. "We might have a few extras," Fred said mildly. "Perhaps a dozen," George added. "Or 3 dozen, Fred corrected. "Possibly 4, George mused, lost count after the first batch. Seamus had already moved closer to the bag, reaching out before apparently thinking better of touching a Weasley twin creation without permission. "Can we—" "That's why we're here," George said. "Couldn't very well test them in an empty classroom, could we? No audience." "And what's a performance without an audience?" Fred added. "Just sad, really," George agreed. By now, the commotion had drawn attention from the dormitories. The door to the girls' staircase creaked open, and a sleepy-looking third year appeared, her hair in a messy braid and her dressing gown inside out. She blinked at the scene before her, the gathered students, the glowing snowflakes, the sound of Christmas carols in November, and her expression shifted from confusion to wonder. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice hushed. "The Weasleys have invented Christmas," Dean said, the snowflake still singing cheerfully from his hair. "Just improved it slightly," Fred corrected. "Christmas was already pretty good," George said. "We've just made it more musical." The third year, Sarah, Lavender thought her name was, crept down the stairs, followed by 2 more girls from her year and, surprisingly, A pair of first years who must have been woken by the singing. They gathered near the fire, their eyes wide and reflecting the soft blue glow of the enchanted snowflakes. "Are they safe?" one of the first years whispered, a tiny girl with gap teeth and freckles. "Define safe," Fred said. "They won't explode," George clarified quickly. "We tested that extensively. After the third explosion, we figured out the stabilization charm," Fred added. "There were explosions?" Sarah asked, taking a step back. "Were," George emphasized. "Past tense. All in the past. We've moved well beyond our explosive phase." "Metaphorically and literally," Fred agreed. The portrait of Tobias McGregor had given up all pretense of disapproval and was now leaning so far forward in his frame that his painted nose nearly touched the canvas. "In all my years at Hogwarts," he muttered, "and that's 3 centuries of observation, mind you, I've never seen snowflakes enchanted to sing. Levitate, certainly. Multiply, frequently. Usually during some unfortunate student's first attempt at weather charms. But sing, that's new." "We do try to innovate," George said modestly. Fred had opened the bag and was now carefully extracting more vials, lining them up on the table with the precision of a potioneer arranging ingredients. Each vial held a snowflake, and no two looked quite the same. Some were large and elaborate, their crystalline structures so complex they seemed almost like tiny castles made of ice. Others were smaller, simpler, but no less beautiful. All of them hummed with that same soft, melodic sound, creating a gentle chorus that filled the common room with anticipation. "Right," Fred said, surveying his audience with satisfaction. "Here's how this works. Each snowflake has been enchanted with a specific carol. When it lands on someone or something, it sings its song. Once, the whole thing, start to finish, then it melts. The magic's temporary," George explained. "Lasts about an hour total, maybe 90 minutes, if conditions are right. We wanted to create something ephemeral, fleeting, special because it doesn't last." "Mum's idea, actually," Fred admitted. "She always says the best moments are the ones you can't hold on to. You just have to be there for them." There was a moment of surprised silence. The Weasley twins weren't usually given to philosophy, preferring pranks and pyrotechnics to deeper thoughts. But standing there in the firelight, surrounded by their magical creations, they seemed older somehow, more thoughtful. Then George ruined it by adding, "Also, we couldn't figure out how to make them last longer without risking another explosion, so we went with Mum's wisdom instead." The moment broke, and laughter rippled through the small crowd. More students were emerging from the dormitories now, drawn by the voices and the singing. A pair of 7th years appeared from the boys' staircase, followed by several more 5th years, and even a stern-looking prefect who opened her mouth to say something about curfew before catching sight of the glowing snowflakes and apparently forgetting what she'd been about to say. Lavender had abandoned all pretense of homework now and was kneeling beside the table, examining the vials with intense fascination. "Which carol is which?" she asked. "No idea," Fred said cheerfully. "That's half the fun," George explained. "We enchanted them in batches. Could be anything from Silent Night to We Wish You a Merry Christmas to that one about the drummers and the pipers and the ladies dancing." "The 12 Days of Christmas," Dean suggested. "That's the one," Freddie said. "Though we tried to avoid that one, actually. Goes on forever." Tested it on Ron earlier. He threatened to hex us by the time it got to the 6 geese a laying. Ron's in bed, Lavender asked, surprised. Ron Weasley usually could be counted on to be in the thick of any late-night mischief. Hermione made him, George said. Something about needing proper rest for optimal learning. He argued, but you know Hermione. She has very firm opinions about sleep schedules. And she's usually right, which makes it worse, Fred added. The common room was filling up now, nearly 24 students gathered around in various states of sleepwear and curiosity. The fire seemed to burn brighter in response to the crowd, and the portraits on the walls were all awake now, craning painted necks to get better views of the proceedings. Even the ones who usually maintained strict neutrality in student affairs were watching with interest. So, what's the plan? The prefect, Alicia, Lavender remembered, a 6th year who'd been made prefect specifically because she was the only one who could occasionally convince the twins to behave, asked, "You're not just going to set them loose, are you?" "That's exactly what we're going to do," Fred said. "Well, not loose exactly," George corrected. "That implies a lack of control. We're going to release them in a controlled fashion." "Very controlled," Fred agreed. "Exceptionally controlled," George added. "We're going to make it snow Christmas carols in the Gryffindor common room," Fred said, abandoning all pretense of technical explanation. "And it's going to be magnificent." He reached for the first vial, his twin mirroring the movement, and together they raised them toward the enchanted ceiling that showed the rain still falling outside. The students below held their collective breath. "Ready?" Fred asked. "Ready," George confirmed. They opened the vials together, and the snowflakes drifted free. 2 at first, then 4 as they opened more vials, then 6, then 10. The snowflakes rose toward the ceiling like tiny stars, spinning and dancing in the warm air currents from the fire. Their combined glow filled the room with soft blue light that competed with the firelight, creating shadows that moved and shifted in patterns that seemed almost alive. For a moment, they just floated there, hanging in the air like crystalline chandeliers. Then, as though responding to some signal only they could hear, they began to descend. The first snowflake landed on Alicia's shoulder, and her expression of stern prefectorial duty dissolved into surprised delight as it began to sing "The Holly and the Ivy" in a voice like crystal bells. The second settled on one of the first year's heads, singing "Good King Wenceslas" with such enthusiasm that the tiny girl started giggling helplessly. More snowflakes descended, each finding a student, or a piece of furniture, or occasionally just hovering in midair, singing their individual carols. The common room filled with music, harmonious and chaotic all at once, a dozen different Christmas songs overlapping and interweaving in ways that somehow worked, creating something that was more beautiful for being imperfect. Dean Snowflake had finished its song and was melting slowly, leaving his hair damp and making him laugh. Lavender had 3 snowflakes now, each singing a different carol, and she was trying to conduct them like an orchestra with increasingly wild hand gestures. The 7th years had started a competition to see who could catch the most snowflakes, while the younger students simply stood with their arms outstretched, faces turned upward, waiting to see which song would choose them. And in the center of it all, Fred and George Weasley stood with matching expressions of satisfaction. watching their creation bring joy to their housemates. Behind them, the fire crackled and popped. The rain continued to fall outside, and somewhere in the portrait frames, Tobias McGregor was definitely smiling, even as he tried to maintain his stern headmaster expression. The common room had transformed. Where there had been quiet study and pre-sleep stillness, now there was music and laughter and the soft glow of enchanted snow. Students who'd been ready for bed were now fully awake, energized by the magic and the sheer, unexpected joy of it all. And then, with a sound like wind chimes in a breeze, nearly headless Nick floated through the wall. The ghost paused mid-glide, his nearly severed head wobbling slightly as he took in the scene. His translucent form made the snowflakes passing through him shimmer and sparkle in ways that defied normal physics. When he spoke, his voice carried the faint echo that all ghosts possessed, but it was warm with amusement. "My word," he said. "What on earth are you lot up to?" Fred and George grinned at each other. This was about to get even more interesting. Nearly headless Nick floated through the portrait hole with the peculiar grace of someone who'd spent 5 centuries perfecting the art of ghostly movement. His ruff, that elaborate Elizabethan collar that failed so spectacularly to hide the near-complete severing of his head, caught the light from the enchanted snowflakes, making it shimmer with an opalescent glow that was almost beautiful. His transparent form rippled slightly as he moved, disturbing the air and sending several snowflakes spiraling away in new directions. "I was drifting past the 4th floor," Nick explained, his voice carrying that hollow, echoing quality that made it sound as though he was speaking from the bottom of a well, "when I heard the most extraordinary sound. Christmas carols. In November. Naturally, I had to investigate." "Naturally," Fred agreed, barely suppressing a grin. "We'd have been offended if you hadn't," George added. Nick floated closer to examine one of the snowflakes that had just landed on the back of a worn armchair. It was singing "Angels We Have Heard on High" with particular enthusiasm, hitting the high notes with a clarity that would have made the frog choir jealous. The ghost leaned in, as much as a mostly headless ghost could lean, and his transparent face split into a delighted smile. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Absolutely remarkable. I haven't seen enchantment work quite like this since, it must have been 1843. Young witch named Prudence Blackwell, lovely girl, terrible at potions, absolutely brilliant at charms. She enchanted the suits of armor to recite poetry. Went wonderfully until one of them started reciting bawdy limericks, and McGonagall's predecessor had to get involved." "Bawdy limericks, you say?" Fred's eyes lit up with dangerous interest. "Filing that away for future reference," George added. "Absolutely not," Alicia said firmly from across the room, though her words lacked conviction as a snowflake landed on her head and began singing "O Come All Ye Faithful" in a voice that sounded suspiciously like Celestina Warbeck. The common room was filling up properly now. Word had spread through the dormitories, passed along through opened doors and whispered conversations, that something extraordinary was happening. Students appeared in increasingly creative states of undress, dressing gowns worn over pajamas, some with mismatched slippers, others barefoot despite the November chill. A second-year boy had apparently been in the middle of getting ready for bed and still had toothpaste foam at the corner of his mouth, forgotten in his haste to join the gathering. The younger students were particularly enchanted. 3 first years, 2 girls and a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, stood in a tight cluster near the fire, their faces turned upward, mouths open in wonder as they watched the snowflakes dance through the air above them. When one particularly elaborate snowflake descended toward them, they held completely still, barely breathing, until it settled on the shoulder of the tallest girl. In the bleak midwinter, the snowflake sang, its voice soft and contemplative. Frosty wind made moan. The girl's eyes filled with tears, though she was smiling. "That's my Gran's favorite," she whispered. "She sang it every Christmas Eve." Her friends moved closer, and for a moment, the 3 of them just stood there, listening to the enchanted snow sing a dead grandmother's favorite carol in the Gryffindor common room at 11:30 on a rainy November night. It was the sort of moment that made magic feel less like spells and wand movements and more like something precious and profound. Fred noticed. He caught George's eye, and something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of surprise, perhaps, that their prank had created something this meaningful. Then the moment passed, and Fred cleared his throat. "Right then," he announced, raising his voice to be heard over the growing chorus of carols. "We've got about 30 snowflakes out now, but that's barely scratched the surface. Reckon we can handle more?" The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Students who'd been content to watch now surged forward, hands outstretched, all wanting to participate in the magic. The prefect, Alicia, made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, but the snowflake on her head was now singing "Ding Dong Merrily on High," and it was difficult to project authority while serving as a mobile carol platform. George reached into the seemingly bottomless bag and withdrew another handful of vials. "Easy now," he cautioned, as eager students pressed closer. "These are delicate. Work too hard on them to have someone knock them all over because they couldn't wait their turn." "Very delicate," Fred emphasized. "Also, somewhat experimental. We're 90% certain they're perfectly safe." 95%, George corrected. "Let's say 93, and split the difference," Fred suggested. Several students took strategic steps backward. The first-year boy looked particularly nervous, though he didn't retreat far enough to actually leave. "What happens in the other 7%? Lavender asked. She'd abandoned all pretense of homework now. Her divination textbook lay forgotten on the hearthrug, a snowflake sitting contentedly on top of it, singing "We Three Kings" to an illustrated diagram of tea leaf reading. "Well," George began. "Mostly nothing," Fred said quickly. "One turned into a toad," George admitted. "That was a fluke," Fred insisted. "And one sang backwards," George continued, "which was actually quite clever, if you think about it," Fred said. "Very avant-garde." "And there was that incident with the purple smoke," George added thoughtfully. "But that one was entirely unrelated to the snowflakes," Fred said. "That was from the experimental fizzing Wheesbees we had in the same pocket." "Probably unrelated," George corrected. "Almost certainly unrelated," Fred agreed. Despite, or perhaps because of, this less than reassuring explanation, the students pressed forward again. There was something about the Weasley twins' chaos that made people want to be part of it, regardless of the potential risks. Perhaps it was because their mischief always came wrapped in genuine joy, or perhaps Gryffindors simply had a collective blind spot when it came to reasonable caution. The twins began distributing the vials more systematically now, handing them out to students with instructions to open them on a count of 3. Dean took one, examining it closely. The snowflake inside was smaller than average but incredibly intricate, with a crystalline structure that formed what looked almost like tiny musical notes. "This one looks different," he observed. "Experimental batch," George explained. "We tried to match the physical structure to the song structure. That one should be Carol of the Bells." "Should be," Dean repeated. 80% certain, Fred said. "Could also be Jingle Bells," George admitted. "Or possibly Silver Bells." We got a bit confused with all the bell-related carols. "There are a surprising number of bell-related carols," Fred mused. "Really committed to bells, those carol writers," George agreed. Seamus had claimed 3 vials and was juggling them carefully, much to Alicia's visible distress. "I can handle them," he insisted. "I'm very coordinated." "You set yourself on fire twice last week," Lavender pointed out. "That was potions class," Seamus said defensively. "Potions doesn't count. Everyone sets themselves on fire in potions." "Not everyone," a quiet voice said from the girls' staircase. Hermione Granger descended the stairs in a sensible dressing gown, her bushy hair plaited for sleep, her expression caught between exasperation and curiosity. "Some of us managed to brew potions without constant combustion." "Hermione," Fred said with exaggerated delight, "come to study our experimental charm work." "Or to lecture us about curfew and proper sleep schedules," George added. "Or both," Fred suggested. "You're excellent at multitasking." Hermione crossed her arms, but her eyes tracked the floating snowflakes with unmistakable interest. A particularly lovely one, larger than most, with a 6-pointed crystalline structure that caught the firelight beautifully, drifted past her, and she couldn't quite suppress the small smile that tugged at her lips when it began singing "O Holy Night" in a voice of surprising depth and warmth. "It's nearly midnight," she said, but her tone lacked its usual firmness. "We all have classes tomorrow. Transfiguration first thing. And Professor McGonagall specifically said." She was interrupted by a snowflake landing directly on top of her head, settling into her bushy hair like a tiny glowing crown. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the snowflake began to sing "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen" in what was unmistakably a male chorus voice, deep, resonant, and completely absurd, coming from Hermione's head. The common room erupted in laughter. Even Hermione couldn't maintain her stern expression, her lips twitching upward as the snowflake sang about comfort and joy from its perch in her hair. She reached up as if to brush it away, then stopped herself, apparently deciding that removing a singing snowflake was beneath her dignity. "Fine," she said, trying to sound severe despite the carol emanating from her head. "But if we all fail Transfiguration tomorrow because we're too tired to properly concentrate—" "We won't," Fred promised. "Cross our hearts," George added. "Besides," Fred continued, "this is educational." "Very educational," George agreed. "Advanced charm work. Practical application of theoretical concepts. Basically an extension of our studies," Fred concluded. "That's complete rubbish," Hermione said. But she was smiling now, properly smiling, and she made no move to return to her dormitory. Instead, she drifted closer to examine the bag of vials, her academic curiosity clearly winning out over her sense of responsibility. More students continued to arrive. The common room was properly crowded now. At least 40 students, filling the space with their presence and their excitement. The noise level had risen accordingly, not just from the snowflakes singing, but from the students themselves, their voices overlapping in conversations about the magic, in laughter, in attempts to harmonize with the enchanted carols. Ron Weasley appeared from the boys' staircase, his hair sticking up at wild angles, his pajamas wrinkled. "What's all this then?" he asked through a yawn, then stopped dead as he registered the scene before him. The floating snowflakes, the singing, the crowd, his brothers at the center of it all. "Oh no, what have you two done now?" "Created Christmas magic," Fred said proudly. "Improved morale," George added. "Conducted important magical research," Fred continued. "You said you were going to bed," Ron said accusingly. "We lied," George said cheerfully. "Obviously," Fred added. Ron opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as a snowflake descended directly towards him. He watched it approach with suspicion, as though expecting it to explode or transform him into something unpleasant. When it finally landed on his shoulder and began singing "Good Christian Men Rejoice," his expression shifted from suspicion to reluctant delight. "That's actually quite clever," he admitted grudgingly. "Still mad you woke me up, but clever." The twins had emptied more than half the bag now, and the common room was beginning to resemble a proper snowstorm, albeit one where every snowflake sang Christmas carols. The air was filled with music, dozens of different songs overlapping in ways that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The enchanted ceiling above them showed the real storm continuing outside, rain lashing the windows, but inside it was warm and bright and filled with impossible magic. Some of the snowflakes had begun to interact in interesting ways. When two singing "Silent Night" drifted close together, their voices harmonized, creating a duet that was unexpectedly beautiful. 3 snowflakes singing different verses of the 12 Days of Christmas somehow synced up, creating a medley that made several students applaud. The younger students had formed a game, trying to catch specific snowflakes, calling out to each other about which carols they'd collected. The first-year girl, whose grandmother loved "In the Bleak Midwinter," had 3 snowflakes now, each singing a different carol, and she was conducting them with solemn concentration, trying to make them harmonize. The older students were more analytical. Hermione had claimed a quill and a scrap of parchment and was taking notes, muttering to herself about resonance frequencies and sympathetic magical harmonics. Dean was sketching the snowflakes, trying to capture their crystalline structures before they melted. Even the 7th years, who usually maintained an air of sophisticated detachment from underclassmen activities, were fully engaged, one of them attempting to levitate multiple snowflakes at once to create a choir. And then, someone tried to replicate the magic. It was Katie Bell, a 6th year and one of Gryffindor's chasers, who drew her wand first. "If it's just a charm," she reasoned, "we should be able to cast it ourselves, right? Frost creation, plus a voice charm maybe." "That's not quite," George started to say, but Katie had already begun her wand movement. "Glaciers," she cast, combined with what sounded like an attempted sonorous charm. What emerged from her wand tip was indeed snow-like, a small burst of frost that floated for approximately 3 seconds before beginning a sound that could charitably be described as musical, only in the loosest possible sense. It was more like a cat being strangled while someone played an accordion underwater. Several students clapped their hands over their ears. The snowflakes already singing in the common room seemed to recoil, their music faltering momentarily. "Finite," Hermione cast quickly, and the sound mercifully stopped. Katie lowered her wand, looking sheepish. "Perhaps it's more complicated than I thought." "Just slightly," Fred said diplomatically. "Only took us 4 weeks to get right," George added. "And 17 minor explosions," Fred continued. 3 minor fires," George said. "1 incident with a confused owl," Fred added. "We don't talk about the owl incident," George said firmly. This didn't discourage the others. Within minutes, half a dozen students were attempting their own variations, with predictably chaotic results. Seamus created something that looked like snow, but tasted like pumpkin juice, based on the expression of the second year who accidentally got some in his mouth. Lavender managed to enchant a cushion to hum, though it only knew 1 note and repeated it endlessly until someone threw it into the fireplace. Dean's attempt produced beautiful snowflakes that were completely silent, floating down like normal snow, which was technically impressive, but missed the entire point. The common room was descending into cheerful chaos. Snowflakes, both the twins' enchanted versions and various student-created abominations, filled the air. The noise level had risen to the point where individual voices were difficult to distinguish, creating a wall of sound that mixed carols with laughter, with the occasional shout of "watch out," as someone's experimental magic went awry. Through it all, the original enchanted snowflakes continued their songs, professional and precise amid the amateur attempts. They seemed almost indignant, their voices growing slightly louder, as if to remind everyone what properly executed magic was supposed to sound like. Nearly headless Nick had drifted to the ceiling, floating among the snowflakes with visible joy. His transparent form made the snowflakes passing through him shimmer and sparkle, and when he moved, he left trails of disturbed air that sent the snowflakes spiraling in new patterns. He'd begun singing along with some of them, his ghostly voice adding an eerie harmony that shouldn't have worked, but somehow enhanced the overall effect. "This is magnificent," he called down. "Absolutely magnificent. The Gryffindors of my day would have loved this, though we'd have probably added more explosions. We were very fond of explosions in the 15th century." "Sounds like you'd have gotten along with Seamus," Ron observed. "Hey," Seamus protested, then paused. "Actually, yeah, probably." The portraits on the walls had all woken up now, and they were reacting in various ways to the spectacle. Some were delighted, leaning out of their frames to get better views or singing along with recognizable carols. Others were scandalized, muttering about proper behavior and respect for curfew, and what was the world coming to when students could just enchant snow to sing whenever they pleased. The portrait of Tobias McGregor had given up all pretense of stern disapproval. His painted face wore an expression of pure delight, and he was conducting the snowflakes nearest his frame with broad, sweeping gestures that made his tartan robes swirl dramatically. "Reminds me of Christmas 1697, he shouted to no one in particular. "We had a choir that year, 30 students, beautiful voices, sang for the Yule feast. This is better though, much better. The students weren't floating for one thing, though we did have an incident with the pudding coming to life. Different kind of magic that." But it was the empty portrait frame above the mantelpiece, McGonagall's personal connection to her office, that suddenly demanded everyone's attention. The frame flickered, and then it was no longer empty. Professor McGonagall's painted face appeared, her tartan robes unmistakable, her expression stern but not, notably, furious. The painted McGonagall surveyed the scene with the comprehensive gaze of someone who'd spent decades managing Gryffindor students and their creativity. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. Her eyes moved from the floating snowflakes to the crowd of students, to the twins standing in the center of it all, still holding their bag of vials. "Mrs. Weasley," the portrait said, her Scottish accent crisp even through canvas, "might I inquire as to what exactly you believe you are doing?" The common room fell silent. Even the snowflakes seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their songs becoming quieter, almost apologetic. Fred and George exchanged glances, and for once they looked genuinely uncertain. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a snowflake that had been drifting lazily near the ceiling suddenly descended rapidly, heading directly for McGonagall's portrait. Before anyone could react, before the twins could even open their mouths to attempt an explanation, the snowflake passed through the frame and landed on painted McGonagall's shoulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Painted McGonagall's eyes widened slightly, the only crack in her stern expression. Then, clear and sweet and impossibly perfect, the snowflake began to sing. "The holly and the ivy, when they are both full grown," it sang, the voice soft and contemplative. "Of all the trees that are in the wood, the holly bears the crown." Painted McGonagall's expression shifted. The sternness didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, transformed by something that looked almost like nostalgia. Her painted eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened, there was a brightness there that might have been tears if portraits could cry. The common room held its collective breath. Even the other snowflakes had fallen silent, as though recognizing that something important was happening. The portrait sang on, its voice filling the quiet space with a carol about holly and ivy, about winter and growth, about old traditions and enduring things. When the song ended, the snowflake began to melt, leaving a small damp spot on painted McGonagall's robes. She looked down at it, then back up at the twins, at the students, at the common room full of enchanted snow and Christmas magic in November. 10 points from Gryffindor, she said quietly, for being out of bed after curfew. The students deflated slightly. Then painted McGonagall's lips twitched upward, just barely, just enough. "And 20 points to Gryffindor," she continued, "for the most impressive charm work I've seen from students this term. Well done, Mrs. Weasley. Quite well done." The portrait flickered and emptied, McGonagall returning to her office, leaving behind a common room of stunned students. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly everyone was applauding, the sound mixing with renewed laughter and the resumed singing of the snowflakes. Fred and George grinned at each other, their relief and pride equally visible. They turned back to their bag of vials, ready to release the rest of their creations. The night was far from over, and Gryffindor Tower had just been given implicit permission to continue the chaos. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, it began to snow Christmas carols, and the Weasley twins' greatest creation was only just beginning. The common room erupted in renewed energy after McGonagall's portrait departed. Students who'd been holding back, uncertain whether they'd all be marched to detention, now threw themselves fully into the experience. The twins, emboldened by what they chose to interpret as professional approval from their head of house, upended the entire bag of vials onto the central table with a dramatic flourish that sent glass clinking and snowflakes humming in anticipation. "Right then," Fred announced, climbing onto the table itself, heedless of the indignant squawk from the portrait of a Victorian witch whose frame hung just behind him. "Since we've been given the McGonagall seal of approval." "Conditional approval," George corrected, joining his brother on the table. "Grudging approval," Fred amended. "Approval adjacent," George suggested. "Let's make this properly brilliant," Fred concluded, spreading his arms wide. "Everyone grab a vial. No, grab 2. Grab 3. We've got 60-odd snowflakes left, and I want this common room looking like the inside of a snow globe in the next 5 minutes." The students surged forward. The table groaned under the combined weight of the twins and the sudden press of eager hands reaching for the vials. Hermione, ever practical even in the midst of chaos, had conjured a cue system, magical numbers appearing in the air above students' heads, but it was immediately ignored as the orderly line dissolved into a good-natured scramble. "Oi, that one's mine," Ron protested as a third year snatched a vial he'd been reaching for. "First come, first served, Weasley," the third year shot back, clutching her prize. "I'm a Weasley too. These are my brother's snowflakes. I have familial rights." "That's not a thing," Hermione informed him, even as she smoothly acquired 3 vials for herself, her superior strategic planning evident. "It should be a thing," Ron grumbled, but he managed to grab 2 vials anyway, holding them up to examine their contents. One held a snowflake that seemed to pulse with golden light, while the other contained a smaller, more delicate specimen that sparkled with silver. Within minutes, nearly every student in the common room held at least 1 vial. Some clutched multiple, cradling them carefully against their chests like precious treasures. The younger students had formed a small cluster near the fireplace, comparing their snowflakes and making predictions about which carols they might contain. "On 3!" George shouted from his position on the table. Everyone opened them together. 1, Fred counted. 2, the crowd joined in. 3. The common room exploded with light and sound. 60 snowflakes emerged simultaneously, rising from their vials like a reverse snowfall, climbing toward the enchanted ceiling in a swirling column of blue and silver and gold light. For a moment, they hung there, suspended in perfect stillness, creating patterns that seemed almost alive, geometric formations that shifted and changed, flowing like water made of winter and starlight. Then they began to sing. It was overwhelming at first, a wall of sound so complete that individual carols couldn't be distinguished. 60 voices, each perfect, each different, all singing at once, created a kind of beautiful chaos that made several students laugh with pure, overwhelmed joy. The sound filled every corner of the common room, seemed to seep into the stone walls themselves, resonated in the ancient timbers of Gryffindor Tower. But then, slowly, something extraordinary happened. The snowflakes began to organize themselves. Those singing, silent night drifted together, forming a cluster near the windows. Their voices harmonized, creating a peaceful melody that contrasted beautifully with the upbeat cluster forming near the fireplace. A collection of snowflakes singing "Deck the Halls" with infectious enthusiasm. More groups formed. "Joy to the World" near the portrait hole. "Hark the herald angels sing" above the staircases. "O come all you faithful" hovering over the table where the twins still stood. "Did you enchant them to do that?" Hermione called up, her voice barely audible over the music. "No," George shouted back, sounding delighted and surprised in equal measure. "They're organizing themselves," Fred added. "The magic's actually responding to musical harmony. That's not supposed to happen." "Is that bad?" a first year asked nervously. "Bad." Fred looked offended. "That's brilliant. We accidentally created self-organizing musical snow." "We're definitely putting that in the product description," George said. "If we ever sell these," Fred agreed. "Which we won't," George clarified quickly, catching Hermione's sharp look. "Because that would be commercializing our art. And definitely not because we're worried about what Mum would say," Fred added. The students had begun moving to position themselves beneath different carol clusters, choosing their favorites, or simply wandering from group to group to experience each song. The common room had transformed into something like a musical gallery, with distinct zones of different carols, all somehow weaving together into a greater whole. Katie Bell had positioned herself directly beneath the Angels We Have Heard on High cluster and was attempting to conduct them with her wand, though the snowflakes seemed cheerfully indifferent to her direction. Dean had found a spot where two different carol groups overlapped and was sketching frantically, trying to capture the visual patterns the snowflakes made as they sang. Seamus, predictably, was conducting an experiment. He'd collected several snowflakes in the space between his cupped hands and was trying to make them sing in rounds, like a proper choir warm-up exercise. It wasn't working. The snowflakes seemed determined to sing their own parts at their own pace, but his concentrated expression and the gentle way he moved his hands suggested he wasn't giving up any time soon. Lavender had discovered something interesting. When she hummed along with the snowflakes, they responded. Not obviously, not dramatically, but their light brightened just slightly. Their voices grew fractionally clearer. She was standing in the middle of the Joy to the World cluster, humming along with obvious joy, several snowflakes orbiting her head like a halo. "They like participation," she called out to anyone listening. "Try singing with them." Several students took up the challenge. Ron, who'd never been particularly musical but had enthusiasm in abundance, joined the "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" group and began belting out the words with more volume than accuracy. The snowflakes didn't seem to mind. If anything, their light grew brighter in response to his terrible pitch. Hermione, ever the researcher, was testing the limits of the magic. She'd positioned herself near a single snowflake that was singing "What Child Is This" in a particularly haunting minor key and was casting detection charms, taking notes, muttering observations about sustained charm duration and impressive magical efficiency. "Hermione," Ron called over, "you're analyzing Christmas carols. Even for you, that's a bit much." "This is remarkably sophisticated magic," Hermione replied, without looking up from her notes. "The charm work alone requires at least 7 interwoven spells, possibly more, and the self-harmonizing aspect suggests some kind of sympathetic magical resonance that I've only read about in theoretical texts. This isn't just impressive. This is potentially publishable research. We're not publishing anything, Fred said quickly, hopping down from the table. The last thing we need is Mum reading about this in Transfiguration today. She doesn't read Transfiguration today, George pointed out, following his brother. She'd start if we were in it, Fred said darkly. She's got a sixth sense for when we're about to get famous for something she'll disapprove of. The younger students had discovered a new game. They were running between carol groups, trying to transition seamlessly from one song to another, making up medleys and laughing when they got the timing wrong. The first-year girl, whose grandmother loved In the Bleak Midwinter, had found the carols cluster, 5 snowflakes singing in perfect harmony, and was standing very still beneath them, her eyes closed, a peaceful expression on her face. Nearly headless Nick was having the time of his afterlife. He discovered that by floating through different carol groups at speed, he could create interesting audio effects. The Doppler effect applied to Christmas carols, resulting in rising and falling pitches that were oddly hypnotic. Several students were watching him zoom around the ceiling, creating swooping, echoing versions of familiar songs. "Nick, you're making Silent Night sound like a police siren," Ron shouted up. "I know," Nick called back gleefully. "Isn't it wonderful? 500 years I've been at Hogwarts, and this is the most fun I've had since the Headless Hunt rejected my application. Again." The portraits were fully invested now. The entire wall of frames had become a kind of audience, painted figures leaning out to get better views, arguing with each other about which carol was best performed, occasionally singing along in their flat, painted voices that couldn't quite match the 3-dimensional magic of the snowflakes, but added their own strange charm to the proceedings. Tobias McGregor had somehow convinced several neighboring portraits to join him in a judging panel. They were holding up painted signs with scores, mostly 7s and 8s, though Sir Cadogan kept insisting every carol deserved a 10 because all songs are victorious in their own way, which rather defeated the purpose of scoring. "That's a 9 at least," McGregor was arguing, pointing at the Hark the Herald Angels Sing cluster. "Listen to that harmony. That's professional quality charm work." "Too bombastic," sniffed a witch in Tudor dress from the frame beside him. "Give me Greensleeves any day. Now that's a proper carol." "Greensleeves is barely a Christmas carol," protested a wizard in Georgian fashion from 3 frames over. "It's a love song that someone stuck a few religious verses onto." "All carols are love songs if you think about it philosophically enough," declared a Renaissance-era portrait of a man who appeared to be some kind of scholar, based on the mountains of painted books surrounding him. The debate dissolved into an argument that pulled in the 6 more portraits, each insisting their era had the superior musical traditions. Fred and George watched with matching expressions of delight. They'd created chaos, yes, but it was the good kind, the kind that brought people together even as it stirred them up. Then someone decided to try improving on the magic. Alicia, the prefect, who'd long since abandoned any pretense of authority, had been watching the self-organizing snowflakes with the calculating expression of someone who played Quidditch at a competitive level. She understood formations, patterns, strategic positioning, and she had an idea. "What if we could control them?" she said, half to herself and half to the 7th year beside her. not individually, but as groups, like conducting an orchestra, but with actual magical control. Dangerous territory, the seventh year warned. That's their magic, their creation. Interfering could... But Alicia had already drawn her wand. She'd been watching Hermione's detection charms, had picked up the basic signature of the twins' magic. She thought she understood it. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. Orchideus Moderato, she cast, improvising wildly, combining a conjuring charm with what she hoped was a tempo control modification. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the snowflakes nearest to her wand tip began to pulse in time with her wand movements. She moved her wand in a conducting pattern, down, across, up, and the snowflakes responded, their volume increasing and decreasing with her gestures. "Brilliant!" Katie breathed. "Alicia, that's brilliant!" Other students rushed to replicate it. Within seconds, half a dozen wands were out, all attempting variations on Alicia's improvised spell. And that's when things started going wonderfully, terribly wrong. The snowflakes, responding to multiple conducting charms at once, began to malfunction in spectacular ways. One cluster started singing their carol backwards, Thigin Tenellis, Ilo Tenellis, in voices that sounded like they'd been pitched down several octaves. Another group decided they were now performing opera, their sweet carol voices replaced by dramatic, vibrato-heavy singing that would have made Celestina Warbeck proud, but was deeply inappropriate for Away in a Manger. A third group apparently decided to protest the interference entirely and began singing in what sounded distinctly like Troll. The guttural, rumbling noises that emerged from their delicate, crystalline forms were so absurd that several students collapsed in helpless laughter. "Stop!" George shouted, waving his arms. "Everyone stop conducting. You're confusing them." But it was too late. The magic had taken on a life of its own. More snowflakes were malfunctioning by the second. One was now singing Jingle Bells to the tune of The Funeral March. Another had gotten stuck on a single note, repeating it endlessly, like a broken record. A particularly large snowflake near the ceiling had begun singing the rude version of Good King Wenceslas, that the twins had specifically tried to exclude, much to Fred's horror and George's poorly suppressed amusement. "This is chaos," Hermione declared, which was rich coming from someone standing in the middle of a common room full of magically singing snow at midnight. "This is brilliant," Seamus countered, as a snowflake near him began singing what sounded like a sea shanty, for no discernible reason. The younger students, far from being alarmed, had decided this was even better than the original plan. They were running around, trying to catch the malfunctioning snowflakes, laughing so hard several of them had tears streaming down their faces. The first-year boy was being followed by a snowflake that was singing We Three Kings, but replacing every word with meow, which should have been annoying, but was somehow the funniest thing he'd ever experienced. Nearly Headless Nick was in hysterics, or as close to hysterics as a ghost could get. He'd accidentally floated through the opera singing cluster and now had several snowflakes following him, singing dramatic arias about mangers and shepherds in voices that would have shattered wine glasses if any had been present. The portraits were no help at all. They were laughing too hard, their painted bodies shaking with mirth, some of them falling right out of their frames onto painted floors, rolling around in their two-dimensional spaces. Fred and George stood in the center of the chaos, looking around at their creation's spectacular deviation from the plan. They looked at each other. They looked at the backwards singing, opera-performing, troll-speaking, meowing snowflakes. They looked at their housemates, laughing so hard, several were actually on the floor. "So," Fred said conversationally, "this is either our greatest success or our most spectacular failure." "Yes," George agreed. "I'm leaning toward success," Fred decided. "Same," George said. They were about to join the chaos when a new voice cut through the cacophony, a voice that was high-pitched, cackling, and decidedly unwelcome. Peeves the poltergeist descended through the ceiling in a shower of his own making, not snow, but confetti mixed with what looked suspiciously like ink. His wide, malicious grin was visible even through the kaleidoscope of singing snowflakes. "What's all this, then? Little Gryffindors having a party without inviting poor old Peeves?" The common room fell silent, except for the snowflakes, who continued their various malfunctions obliviously. Every student froze. Peeves at his best was exhausting. Peeves encountering something this perfectly pranky was potentially catastrophic. Fred and George exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. Then, simultaneously, they grinned. If Peeves wanted chaos, they'd give him chaos, Weasley style. "Actually, Peeves," Fred said, his voice carrying clearly through the common room, "we were just wondering what would happen if a poltergeist tried to pop one of these snowflakes." "Like a balloon," George added innocently. Peeves's eyes lit up with malevolent glee. "Pop them, pop them." "Oh, Peeves loves popping things." He zoomed toward the nearest cluster of snowflakes, the ones still faithfully singing "Joy to the World," with his hands outstretched, fingers ready to squish and destroy. What happened next would be talked about in Gryffindor Tower for years to come. The moment Peeves's ectoplasmic fingers touched the first snowflake, it exploded, not violently, but magnificently, into a shower of sparkles. But instead of disappearing, the sparkles reformed into a dozen tiny snowflakes, each one singing, "Peeves is a pest, Peeves is a pest," to the tune of Jingle Bells. Peeves recoiled in shock. "What? How dare?" He popped another one. This time, the explosion reformed into snowflakes singing, "Go away, Peeves, nobody wants you here," to the tune of "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Fred was grinning so hard, his face hurt. "Did I mention we made special anti-Peeves versions for exactly this scenario?" "We know our audience," George added proudly. Peeves, never one to back down from a challenge, went into a popping frenzy. He zoomed around the common room, popping every snowflake he could reach, and each one reformed into an insulting chorus. Within minutes, the air was filled with dozens of tiny snowflakes, all singing various rude remarks about Peeves to cheerful Christmas melodies. "Peeves smells like old socks." "Nobody likes a poltergeist." "Go haunt the dungeons, you floating nuisance." The students were in absolute hysterics. Ron had actually fallen off his chair. Hermione was trying to maintain composure, but failing, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Even the portraits were cheering, several of them conducting the anti-Peeves snowflakes with painted batons. Peeves, finding himself the target rather than the tormentor, let out a shriek of frustration and zoomed back up through the ceiling, pursued by at least 20 snowflakes singing increasingly creative insults. His voice echoed down from somewhere above. "I'll get you, Weasleys. Just you wait. The threat was cut off by what sounded like Sir Cadogan's portrait shouting, "Tally-ho, after the villain," followed by the sounds of a painted sword clanging against something. The common room erupted in applause. Fred and George took exaggerated bows, clearly delighted with how that had played out. The regular snowflakes, having apparently recovered from the conducting chaos, had returned to their gentle harmonies, though a few still occasionally sang in troll voices or meowed unexpectedly. As the applause died down and students began to catch their breath, a small first year raised her hand tentatively. "Yes," George acknowledged her. "Are there any more snowflakes?" she asked hopefully. Or did Peeves pop them all? The twins' grins returned. Fred reached into his robes, a different pocket this time, and pulled out one more vial. This one was different from the others. Larger, with a snowflake inside that seemed to contain actual, tiny constellations within its crystalline structure. "We saved one special one," Fred said quietly, "for the right moment." "What does this one do?" someone asked. The twins exchanged glances. "Only one way to find out," George said, and together they opened the vial. The constellation snowflake rose slowly, majestically, until it reached the exact center of the common room. It hung there, rotating gently, and began to sing. Not a carol this time, but something older, something that sounded like starlight would sound if it had a voice. Every other snowflake in the room fell silent, every student stilled. Even the portraits stopped their chatter. For just a moment, Gryffindor Tower held its breath and listened to something beautiful and strange and perfect. Then, as gently as it had begun, the song ended. The constellation snowflake began to fall, and as it descended, every other snowflake in the room began to melt. The show was ending, but it wasn't over yet. The constellation snowflake's descent was almost ceremonial. It fell slowly, rotating as it dropped, its inner stars twinkling with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple magic. Students watched in reverent silence as it made its way downward, past the enchanted ceiling that still showed rain falling outside, past the floating remnants of other snowflakes that had begun their gentle dissolution, down toward the hearth where the fire burned low and warm. Just before it reached the mantelpiece, a small hand shot out and caught it. The first-year girl, the one whose grandmother had loved in the bleak midwinter, held the constellation snowflake cupped between her palms like a precious secret. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the tiny stars contained within the ice crystal. For a moment, she simply stood there, feeling the cold magic against her skin, listening to the fading echo of that strange, beautiful song. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. Then she opened her hands, and the snowflake completed its journey, settling on the warm stone of the hearth where it began to melt in earnest, leaving behind a damp spot that sparkled faintly in the firelight. The spell broke. The other snowflakes, as if they'd been waiting for permission, began melting more rapidly. It wasn't a sad dissolution. There was something peaceful about it, natural, like watching the end of a gentle snowfall. They didn't vanish with dramatic pops or flashes. They simply became water, leaving behind dampness and the lingering scent of winter and pine. "Wait, no," Ron protested, watching the snowflake on his shoulder begin to shrink. "Can't we preserve them? Put them in the cold store or something?" "That's not how the magic works," Hermione said, though she sounded regretful. Her own snowflakes had already melted. leaving dark spots on her dressing gown that she kept touching absently, as though trying to hold on to the memory of their weight. The charm is designed to be temporary. Preservation would require completely different spell work, probably a stasis charm combined with— "Nobody wants a lecture, Hermione," Ron muttered, but without real heat. He was too busy watching his snowflake sing its last few notes of "God rest ye merry gentlemen" before dissolving into his pajama sleeve. The common room was slowly returning to its normal appearance, though normal was perhaps generous. The carpet was soaked in irregular patterns, where clusters of snowflakes had congregated. The furniture bore damp spots, like abstract art. Several students' hair was wet, and the general humidity level had risen enough that the windows had fogged over, obscuring the view of the rain outside. Dean's sketches, at least, had survived. He'd been careful to work on dry parchment away from the main chaos. He held them up now, showing anyone interested his attempts to capture the snowflake's crystalline structures. They were good, surprisingly detailed, each one labeled with the carol it had sung and notes about its behavior. "You should keep these," Hermione told him seriously. This was experimental magic. Documentation is important. "I'm keeping them because they're beautiful," Dean corrected, but he looked pleased. The younger students were gathering the empty vials, collecting them with the solemnity of archaeologists handling ancient artifacts. They'd lined them up on one of the tables, creating a small glass memorial to the evening's magic. The vials still held traces of frost on their inner surfaces, tiny crystalline patterns that caught the firelight. "Do you think they'll work again?" one second year asked Fred hopefully. "If you put new snowflakes in them?" "Maybe," Fred said, though his tone suggested otherwise. The vials were specifically prepared, cleaned with melted snow from the astronomy tower, blessed under moonlight, infused with preserved winter air. "We might have made that last part up," George admitted. "Which part?" the second year asked. "Not sure," Fred said. "We did so much experimental nonsense we lost track of what actually mattered and what we just thought sounded impressive." "That's terrible experimental methodology," Hermione said automatically. "That's creative genius," George corrected. "Same thing, really," Fred added. The portraits had settled down from their earlier excitement, but remained alert and chatty, discussing the evening's events with the animated enthusiasm of people who'd witnessed something genuinely novel. Even for magical paintings who'd observed centuries of student mischief, singing snowflakes were apparently noteworthy. Best entertainment since the Ravenclaw prefect accidentally turned himself into a door knocker in 1889, declared a witch in medieval dress. "What about the incident with the animated suits of armor in 52? Countered a wizard who appeared to be from the Edwardian era. "Which 52? Someone asked. 1752, the wizard clarified. "Or possibly 1852. Time gets fuzzy." "That's not how linear time works," a Renaissance scholar's portrait interjected. "It is for paintings." Several portraits responded in unison. Tobias McGregor had descended from his usual spot above the fireplace, his painted form simply walking down through the wall into a lower frame that usually held a sleeping cat. The cat, displaced, gave him an annoyed look and stalked off to a different painting entirely. "In all seriousness," McGregor said, his Scottish accent as thick as ever, "that was extraordinary magic. I've seen students attempt weather charms music enchantments, all manner of creative spell work. But I have never seen anything combine technical precision with artistic vision quite like that. You two should be proud." Fred and George exchanged surprised glances. Compliments from portraits were common enough. They were a chatty bunch, generally well disposed towards students. But there was something in McGregor's tone that suggested genuine professional respect. "Thank you, sir," they said, almost in unison, and for once they sounded like the sincere, hard-working students they actually were beneath all the pranking. The moment was interrupted by a distant crash from somewhere above them, followed by Peeves's distinctive cackling. The anti-Peeves snowflakes had apparently found him. The ceiling echoed with sounds of pursuit, insults being sung in cheerful harmonies, and what sounded like Sir Cadogan's portrait, shouting encouragement to the snowflakes as though they were horses in a joust. "Should we be concerned about that?" Katie asked, glancing up at the ceiling. "Probably," Fred admitted. "But not enough to actually do anything about it," George added. "Peeves can handle himself," Fred said. "And if he can't, well, that's character building," George concluded. The sounds of chaos continued above. Peeves shouting threats, snowflakes singing insults, Sir Cadogan providing unnecessary narration. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more ominous than the noise had been. Everyone looked up at the ceiling. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with absolutely no warning, Peeves shot down through the ceiling at high speed, trailing what appeared to be approximately 30 tiny snowflakes, all singing variations on "Peeves is a nuisance" to different Christmas melodies. He zoomed around the common room in a panic, zigzagging between startled students, knocking over a chair, sending a stack of textbooks flying. The snowflakes followed him with single-minded determination, their tiny voices creating a chaotic chorus of insults that somehow remained melodically pleasant, even as they were personally devastating. "Make them stop," Peeves wailed, all his usual malice replaced by something approaching genuine distress. "Make them stop singing about Peeves." "Say please," Fred called out. "Say pretty please," George added. "Please," Peeves shrieked, dodging around a bookshelf with the snowflakes in hot pursuit. "Pretty please," Fred insisted. "With sugar on top," George added. "Pretty please with sugar on top." Peeves howled, and he sounded so genuinely desperate that several students started laughing again, though not unkindly. The twins exchanged glances, then nodded. Together, they raised their wands and cast in unison. "Finite incantatum." The pursuing snowflakes exploded into harmless sparkles that drifted down like glitter, their songs ending mid-insult. Peeves stopped mid-zoom, hovering near the ceiling, looking around wildly as though expecting another attack. When none came, his usual nasty grin slowly returned. "That wasn't funny," he declared, though his tone suggested he thought it was at least a little bit funny. "It was hilarious," Ron said. "Absolutely brilliant," Seamus agreed. "Best thing I've seen all term," Katie added. Peeves glared at them all, but there was something almost respectful in his expression now. The twins had managed to prank the prankster, and in Peeves's complicated moral universe, that apparently earned some kind of recognition. "Fine," he said. "Peeves admits it was clever, very clever. But Peeves will remember this, Weasleys." "Oh yes, Peeves has a very long memory for pranks." "Is that a threat or a promise?" George asked. "Both," Peeves declared. Then he paused, floating lower, examining the common room with an assessing gaze. The remaining snowflakes, the original ones, not the anti-Peeves versions, were nearly all melted now. Only a handful remained, singing their carols quietly as they slowly dissolved. "These snowflakes," Peeves said slowly, "they're really going away. All of them." "That's the magic," Fred explained. "Temporary beauty, here and then gone." Peeves drifted closer to one of the last surviving snowflakes, a medium-sized one singing "The First Noel" in a voice like wind, chimes. He reached out one translucent finger, not to pop it, but to touch it gently, almost reverently. The snowflake continued singing, undisturbed by the contact. "Peeves likes temporary things," the poltergeist said quietly, and for just a moment, he sounded almost philosophical. "Nothing lasts. Even poltergeists know that. Buildings crumble. People leave. But music—" He paused, listening to the snowflake's song. "Music keeps happening. New music, different music, but always music." The common room had gone quiet again, everyone staring at Peeves in various states of shock. Peeves didn't do serious. Peeves didn't do contemplative. Peeves did chaos and mischief and occasionally property damage, but never, never did he do profound. "Did Peeves just have a moment?" Ron whispered to Hermione. "I think he did," Hermione whispered back, sounding awed. The moment stretched. The snowflake finished its song and began to melt against Peeves's finger. He watched it dissolve, his expression unreadable. Then, as if suddenly remembering who and what he was, he shook himself, his grin snapping back into place like a mask. "Right," he declared in his usual manic voice. "Peeves is bored now. Peeves is going to go bother the Hufflepuffs. Their common room smells like biscuits, and it makes Peeves angry. Good night, little Gryffindors. Don't have nightmares about singing snow." He shot up through the ceiling and was gone, his cackling fading as he presumably headed toward the basement and the unsuspecting Hufflepuffs. The students exchanged bewildered glances. "What just happened?" Dean asked. "I think Peeves had an existential moment," Hermione said slowly. "About Christmas carols," Lavender added. "That's the most Hogwarts sentence I've ever heard," Ron decided. The portraits, who'd been silent during Peeves's unexpected philosophical turn, burst back into conversation all at once, apparently having held themselves back until the poltergeist left. They were discussing what they'd just witnessed with the intense fascination of people who'd seen something genuinely unprecedented. "In 300 years, Tobias McGregor said, sounding stunned. "I have never seen Peeves have a sincere moment. He pranked the Bloody Baron in 1623 and felt nothing," added a Victorian-era wizard. "He turned the entire third floor into a swamp in 1889 and laughed about it for decades," contributed a witch in Georgian dress. "He made the suits of armour sing bawdy limericks for a week in 1952, the first 1952, and showed no remorse," said the Edwardian wizard. "But singing snowflakes made him think about impermanence," McGregor continued, shaking his painted head. "Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. You two," he pointed at the twins, "have created something special here. More special than you might realize." Fred and George were looking uncharacteristically thoughtful. They'd set out to create a fun prank, a bit of chaos to brighten a rainy November night. They hadn't expected to make their housemates this happy. They certainly hadn't expected to give Peeves an existential crisis. "We should probably document this," Hermione said, pulling out a fresh piece of parchment. "The magical theory alone is worth studying. But the emotional impact, the way the snowflakes affected not just students, but even a poltergeist, that's unprecedented. "You're going to write a paper about our prank?" George asked. "I'm going to write a paper about your breakthrough in sympathetic emotional enchantment," Hermione corrected. "With your permission, of course. I'd need to interview you about the spell construction process, the charm layering, the temporal limitations." "Hermione," Ron said gently, "it's after midnight. Maybe save the academic enthusiasm for morning." "It's already morning," Hermione pointed out. "It's 12:47. Morning started 47 minutes ago." "You know what I mean." The last few snowflakes were melting now. The students who'd been most affected by specific carols gathered near them, wanting to hear those particular songs one final time. The first-year girl was back at the "In the Bleak Midwinter" snowflake, which had somehow survived longer than most others, still singing its gentle, contemplative melody. When it finally melted, she wiped her eyes quickly and smiled. "My Gran would have loved this," she said to no one in particular. She always said Christmas magic was about sharing joy, not keeping it. Several other students made similar comments, sharing stories about family traditions, about favorite carols, about Christmases past. The common room, which had been filled with chaotic energy just minutes before, now held a different feeling, something warmer, more intimate. The twins' prank had become something more, something that connected people to each other and to their memories. The fat lady's portrait, the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, was singing now. Her voice wasn't magical like the snowflakes had been, just enthusiastic and slightly off-key. But she was working her way through Good King Wenceslas with genuine joy. Several portraits in the corridor beyond had apparently joined her, creating an impromptu portrait choir that echoed through the tower. "The whole castle's going to be singing by morning," Katie predicted. "McGonagall's going to murder us," George said, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. "Worth it," Fred decided. The common room was definitely feeling the late hour now. The initial adrenaline of the snowflake chaos had worn off, and students were beginning to yawn, to slump in their chairs, to remember that they had classes in the morning and really should be sleeping. The younger ones were particularly affected. The first years could barely keep their eyes open, their excitement giving way to exhaustion. "Right," Alicia said, finally remembering she was a prefect and had responsibilities. "Everyone should really get to bed. We've got," she checked the clock on the mantelpiece, 6 hours until breakfast. That's not nearly enough sleep, but it's what we've got." There were token protests, but they were half-hearted. The magic was over. The snowflakes had melted. The common room was damp and slightly chaotic, but otherwise normal. It was time for the night to end. Students began drifting toward the staircases, moving slowly, reluctant to let the evening go completely. They were talking in small groups, sharing favorite moments, laughing about Peeves's reaction, humming snatches of carols. The younger students were helping each other up the stairs, the older ones making sure no one was left behind. Hermione had cornered the twins and was already asking detailed questions about their enchantment process, pulling out parchment and quill despite the hour. Ron stood nearby, trying to look interested, but mostly just yawning. Dean was still sketching, capturing the empty common room with its damp patches and general disarray, wanting to remember exactly what it looked like after the magic. The portraits were settling down for the rest of the night, returning to their frames, resuming their usual positions. But they were still talking among themselves, discussing the snowflakes, comparing them to other magical events they'd witnessed over the centuries. Tobias McGregor caught Fred's eye and gave him a small nod of approval before walking back up through the frames to his usual position above the mantelpiece. Nearly headless Nick floated down from the ceiling, where he'd been drifting peacefully since Peeve's departure. "That was wonderful," he told the twins sincerely. "Truly wonderful. In 500 years at Hogwarts, I've seen a great deal of magic, but I don't think I've seen anything quite so joyful. Thank you for that." "Thanks for joining in, Nick," George said. "Couldn't have done it without the ghost effects," Fred added. Nick beamed, or at least his translucent face attempted an expression of pleasure, and then drifted away toward wherever ghosts went during the deep night hours. The fire had burned down to embers now, just a gentle glow that barely illuminated the common room. The rain outside had lessened to a drizzle, visible through the cleared patches on the foggy windows. The castle around them had settled into that particular quality of late-night silence, the sense of a building at rest. Katie was one of the last to head up to the girls' dormitory. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to look at the twins. "You know," she said, "you two are going to be legends after this. Years from now, students will still be talking about the night it snowed Christmas carols in Gryffindor Tower." "That's the plan," Fred said. "Leave our mark," George agreed. "Make Hogwarts just a bit more magical," Fred added. "Then it already is," George finished. Katie smiled and disappeared up the stairs. The common room was nearly empty now, just the twins, Hermione still taking notes, Ron fighting to stay awake, Dean finishing his last sketch, and a handful of older students who were tidying up the worst of the mess with their wands. Lavender was collecting the empty vials, stacking them carefully in a box she'd conjured. "What are you going to do with these?" she asked the twins. "Keep them," Fred said immediately. "As prototypes," George added. "First edition," Fred continued. "Never know when we might need to recreate the magic," George concluded. "Or improve on it," Fred said, and his tone suggested his mind was already working on version 2.0. The tidying didn't take long. A few Scourgify charms, some targeted drying spells, furniture righted, and cushions fluffed. Within minutes, the common room looked almost normal again. Almost. There was still a faint scent of winter in the air, and if you looked closely, you could see tiny sparkles in the carpet where the constellation snowflake had melted, refusing to be completely cleaned away. Hermione finally ran out of questions, or perhaps just ran out of energy to ask them. She tucked her notes away carefully, already organizing them mentally into paper sections. "This really was extraordinary magic," she told the twins seriously. "You should be proud." "We are," George assured her. "Very proud," Fred agreed. "Also exhausted," George added. "It's been a long night," Fred said. "And we've got potions first thing tomorrow," George remembered with a groan. "Today," Hermione corrected. "We have potions first thing today, in approximately 5.5 hours. "Stop helping, Hermione," Ron mumbled, finally giving up on staying awake and heading for the boys' staircase. The twins followed, after taking one last look around the common room they'd transformed. Dean went next, his sketches rolled carefully under his arm. Hermione was the last to go. pausing to bank the fire properly with her wand, to straighten a few more cushions, to be the responsible one even now. Just before she reached the girls' staircase, she paused and looked back. The common room was quiet, peaceful, normal. But there, on the mantelpiece, something caught the faint glow of the embers. A single snowflake, impossibly, inexplicably, sat on the stone, not melting, just existing. As Hermione watched, it began to sing very softly, almost too quiet to hear. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Hermione smiled. Some magic, apparently, knew when to break its own rules. She whispered good night to the snowflake and climbed the stairs to bed, leaving the common room to its silence and its impossible, persistent bit of winter magic. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and in Gryffindor Tower, a single snowflake sang on into the darkness, keeping watch until morning. The snowflake on the mantelpiece had fallen silent by the time the first rays of dawn crept through the common room windows. It still sat there, refusing to melt, its crystalline structure catching the pale morning light and throwing tiny rainbows across the stone. The common room itself bore only subtle evidence of the night's chaos. A faint dampness in the carpet, cushions not quite in their usual positions, and that persistent scent of winter pine that shouldn't have been possible in a castle in November. Hermione was the first down the girls' staircase, appearing at precisely 6:30 with her bag already packed and her hair wrestled into submission. She stopped immediately upon seeing the snowflake, still pristine on the mantelpiece, and pulled out a fresh piece of parchment to add to her notes. The snowflake remained stubbornly silent as she cast detection charms, measuring the magical signature, muttering about unprecedented temporal stability and fascinating deviation from expected decay patterns. By 7 o'clock, word had spread through the tower. Students descended the staircases in various states of wakefulness, all making pilgrimages to the mantelpiece to see the snowflake that had defied the twins' own magic. Some reached out to touch it, pulling back when they felt the cold radiating from its surface. Others simply stared, wondering if it would sing again. "It's not supposed to still be here," George said, for the 5th time, examining the snowflake from multiple angles while students ate hurried breakfasts around him. The temporal charm was specifically limited, 90 minutes maximum duration. It's been nearly 7 hours. "Maybe we're better at magic than we thought," Fred suggested, though he looked equally baffled. "Or maybe the magic evolved," Hermione said, not looking up from her notes. Sympathetic enchantments can sometimes develop unexpected characteristics when exposed to strong emotional resonance. The amount of joy generated last night might have actually strengthened the temporal matrix instead of depleting it. "Sure," Ron said, through a mouthful of toast. "Or it's just a really stubborn snowflake." The first years were gathered in a small cluster near the fireplace, taking turns standing close to the snowflake, hoping it might sing for them. The girl whose grandmother had loved In the Bleak Midwinter stood closest, her hand hovering near the snowflake, but not quite touching it, as though afraid she might break whatever magic was keeping it alive. Students heading down to breakfast kept pausing at the portrait hole, taking one last look at the snowflake, as though trying to memorize it before classes pulled them away. The portraits were awake and chatty, still discussing the previous night's events with the enthusiasm of people who'd witnessed history. "Mark my words, Tobias McGregor proclaimed from his frame above the mantelpiece. That snowflake's going to be there come Christmas. Probably longer. Magic that strong doesn't just disappear because it's supposed to. Unless McGonagall makes it disappear. A witch in Tudor dress pointed out practically. She's not one for unauthorized persistent enchantments. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Professor McGonagall's portrait frame above the fireplace flickered and filled. This time, it wasn't her painted representation. It was a live magical connection, showing the actual Professor McGonagall in her office, already dressed in her usual dark robes and pointed hat, despite the early hour. The common room fell silent instantly. Students who'd been heading toward the portrait hole froze mid-step. Those eating breakfast set down their toast. The twins, who'd been arguing about magical theory with Hermione, went very still. McGonagall surveyed the common room through the frame, her expression unreadable. Her eyes moved from the gathered students to the damp patches on the carpet, to the snowflake sitting innocently on the mantelpiece. For a long moment, she said nothing, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. "Mrs. Weasley," she finally said, her Scottish accent crisp in the early morning quiet. "A word, please. In my office. Immediately." Fred and George exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. Worry, defiance, resignation, and underneath it all, the faint hope that they might somehow talk their way out of whatever consequences were coming. "Yes, Professor," they said in unison, setting down their wands and heading toward the portrait hole with the resigned air of students who'd made this walk to McGonagall's office many times before. "The rest of you," McGonagall continued, her gaze sweeping the room, "have classes to attend and breakfast to finish. I suggest you all remember that while creativity is valued at Hogwarts, so is adequate rest. Anyone falling asleep in lessons today will find themselves in detention, magical snowflakes or no magical snowflakes." The portrait flickered and went dark. The twins disappeared through the portrait hole, and the remaining students began a flurry of anxious speculation. "She's going to expel them," a second year said dramatically. "Don't be ridiculous," Hermione said sharply. "She gave them points last night. She's not going to expel them for something she essentially approved." "She might take the points back," Katie suggested, "and add detention, lots of detention." "Worth it," Ron said loyally. "That was the best night of term. If they get detention, we should all volunteer to serve it with them." "That's not how detention works," Hermione informed him. "It should be," Ron insisted. The common room slowly emptied as students headed to breakfast, casting worried glances back at the portrait hole as though they might see the twins returning with news. The younger students were particularly concerned. Several first years looked on the verge of tears, as though personally responsible for the twins' predicament. Only the persistent snowflake remained unchanged, sitting on its perch, cold and perfect and silent. McGonagall's office was exactly as the twins remembered it from their various previous visits, tidy to the point of severity, with straight-backed chairs, positioned before a massive desk, shelves lined with books and artifacts from her decades of teaching, and a small window that looked out over the grounds. The early morning light filtered through, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the air. The actual Professor McGonagall sat behind her desk, her hands folded precisely on its surface, her expression impossible to read. She let the twins stand in uncomfortable silence for a full minute before speaking. "Sit," she said finally, gesturing to the chairs. They sat, both acutely aware that this was different from their usual disciplinary visits. McGonagall usually led with the offense, with exactly what they'd done wrong and why it was unacceptable. This silence, this measured consideration, was new territory. 63 snowflakes, McGonagall said quietly. 63 individual enchantments, each one containing at minimum 7 layered charms, each one temporally limited, each one programmed with specific musical content. That's over 400 individual spell components, woven together so seamlessly that they appeared to function as single unified charms. She paused, and her expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something approaching approval. The magical theory alone would qualify as NEWT level work. The execution was flawless, and the creativity. She paused again, and now her lips definitely twitched upward. The creativity was extraordinary. Fred and George exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't going the way disciplinary meetings usually went. However, McGonagall continued, and the twins braced themselves for the inevitable. However, you created and deployed 63 experimental charms in a common room full of students without proper safety protocols, without supervision, and well past curfew. You disturbed the entire tower, possibly the entire castle, given that the portraits were singing until nearly 2 in the morning. And you have somehow managed to create a snowflake that is refusing to obey its own dissolution charm, which represents a potentially problematic persistent enchantment. She fixed them with a stern look. What do you have to say for yourselves? It was worth it, Fred offered tentatively. Everyone loved it, George added. Even you seem to like it, Fred continued, gaining confidence. Your portrait, I mean. When the snowflake landed on her, on you, and sang the holly and the ivy, you looked. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence without overstepping. McGonagall's expression softened slightly. She looked down at her desk, at her folded hands, and for a moment she seemed far away, lost in some memory the twins couldn't access. My mother sang that carol, she said quietly. Every Christmas Eve, after dinner, while my father stoked the fire and my brother pretended to be too old for such things, but always joined in by the second verse. It's been many years since I heard it sung quite that way, with that particular warmth. She looked up, and her eyes were bright, but not quite tearful. So yes, Mr. Weasley, I did like it, very much, which is why I'm torn between giving you both detention until Christmas and nominating you for special services to the school award. The twins gaped at her. McGonagall allowed herself a small smile at their expressions. Make no mistake, she continued, her tone becoming crisp and professional again. What you did was technically against several school rules. Creating experimental magic without supervision violates the statute on unauthorized spell development. Deploying it in a communal space violates safety protocols. Staying up past curfew is, obviously, a curfew violation. And disturbing the peace of Hogwarts Castle after midnight could be considered grounds for serious disciplinary action. She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the grounds where early morning mist was lifting from the grass. The twins sat very still, waiting. But, McGonagall said, still gazing out the window, it has been a difficult term. The war may be over, but its shadows remain. Students are anxious. Some have lost family members. Others are dealing with trauma. The castle itself still bears scars from the battle, despite our best repair efforts. And into all of that darkness and worry, you brought light, joy, wonder. You reminded everyone, students, portraits, even ghosts, what magic can be when it's used not for fighting or protection or survival, but simply for beauty and happiness. She turned back to face them, and her expression was complex, stern and warm all at once, the face of a teacher who cared deeply about her students, even when they frustrated her. "So here is what we're going to do," she said, returning to her desk and sitting down with precise movements. "You will both serve detention, 3 evenings each, helping me reorganize the Transfiguration supply cupboards. That's for the rule violations and the lack of proper safety protocols." The twins nodded, accepting this as fair. "However," McGonagall continued, "I am also awarding Gryffindor 50 points, 25 each, for exceptional charm work and creative application of magical theory. Additionally, I am requiring you both to document your spell development process and submit it as an independent study project. If the work is up to standard, it will count toward your charm's NEWT as an advanced practical." The twins' mouths fell open simultaneously. We're getting points," George managed. "An NEUT credit," Fred added, sounding stunned. "Did I stutter, Mr. Weasley?" McGonagall asked, raising one eyebrow. "You performed NEWT level magic. You should receive NEWT level recognition, though I expect the documentation to be thorough, properly formatted, and submitted by the end of term. And if I discover that Miss Granger wrote any of it for you, the offer is rescinded immediately." "We'll do it ourselves," George promised quickly. "Properly formatted and everything," Fred added. "See that you do." McGonagall picked up a quill and made a note on a piece of parchment. "Now, regarding the persistent snowflake currently sitting on your common room mantelpiece and refusing to melt. We don't know why it's still there," Fred said quickly. "The temporal charm should have expired hours ago. We tested it extensively. 90 minutes was the absolute maximum duration before magical exhaustion forced dissolution. And yet, there it sits," McGonagall said dryly. "Have you considered that perhaps the magic evolved beyond your original parameters?" "Hermione suggested that," George admitted. "Something about emotional resonance affecting the temporal matrix. Miss Granger is, as usual, likely correct." McGonagall set down her quill. "Strong positive emotions can sometimes strengthen enchantments, particularly those involving artistic or aesthetic magic. You created something that brought profound joy to many people. That joy fed back into the magic, sustaining it beyond its intended duration." She stood again, moving towards her office door. "Come with me. We're going to visit your common room, and you're going to teach me exactly how you created those snowflakes. If one has persisted, others might as well. And I need to know if they represent any danger to students." The twins followed her through the corridors, which were mostly empty at this early hour. A few students rushed past, hurrying to breakfast before first period. The portraits they passed were all awake, and several called out cheerful greetings or congratulations to the twins, who were now thoroughly confused about whether they were in trouble or being celebrated. The fat lady was awake and in good voice, practicing scales when they arrived. She took in the sight of McGonagall flanking the Weasley twins, and her painted face split into a delighted grin Come to see the miracle snowflake, Professor? She asked cheerfully. The whole portrait network's been talking about it. Some paintings on the 4th floor are taking bets on how long it'll last. Password, please, McGonagall said, ignoring the commentary. Fortis Fortuna, the fat lady said, swinging open. The common room was nearly empty. Most students were at breakfast. Only Hermione remained, still taking notes near the mantelpiece, and the first-year girl, who was sitting cross-legged on the hearth, watching the snowflake with patient devotion. Both looked up in surprise when McGonagall entered with the twins. Hermione immediately stood, her expression shifting to concern. The first year looked terrified, as though she might have done something wrong by staying behind. Miss Granger, McGonagall acknowledged with a nod. I should have known you'd still be here, documenting. And you are... Emma, Professor, the first year squeaked. Emma Whitmore. I just wanted to. You wanted to see the snowflake, McGonagall said, her tone gentling. That's quite all right, Miss Whitmore. Though you should get some breakfast soon. Growing witches need proper nutrition. She moved to the mantelpiece, examining the snowflake with the critical eye of a master transfiguration professor. She didn't touch it, but her wand moved in small, precise patterns, casting diagnostic charms that lit up the air around the snowflake with soft amber light. Fascinating, she murmured. The temporal charm is still active, but it's been reinforced by something else. Something that wasn't part of your original spell work. She glanced at the twins. Did either of you add any emotional resonance components? Any empathy charms or connection enchantments? No, Professor, Fred said. We kept it simple. Well, as simple as 7-layered charms can be. Weather magic for the snow creation, stasis charm for preservation, animation for the movement, audio enchantment for the singing, targeting spell for landing on people, dissolution charm for the melting, and a timing component to coordinate everything. And yet there's an 8th layer now, McGonagall said, still studying the diagnostic readings. Something that feels like hope, joy. It's difficult to classify. Miss Granger, what do your notes say about the emotional responses last night? Hermione consulted her parchment. Universally positive, Professor. Multiple students reported feelings of profound happiness, nostalgia, connection to family memories, and general warmth. Several of the younger students said it reminded them of home. And there was that moment with Peeves where he seemed to have an unexpected philosophical response to the temporary nature of the magic. Peeves had a philosophical moment. McGonagall's eyebrows rose. Now that is noteworthy. He talked about how music keeps happening even when individual songs end, George explained. It was actually quite profound. Then he went back to being Peeves and bothered the Hufflepuffs. McGonagall's lips twitched. Of course he did. She completed her diagnostic charms and lowered her wand. This snowflake isn't dangerous. If anything, it's remarkably stable. Whatever additional magic is sustaining, it appears to be entirely benign, a natural evolution of the original enchantment, strengthened by the collective positive emotion it generated. She turned to face the small group. I am going to leave it where it is, as a reminder of what magic can achieve when it's born from joy rather than necessity. However, her gaze sharpened. If any more snowflakes persist beyond their intended duration, I expect to be informed immediately. Understood? Yes, Professor, the twins chorused. Good. McGonagall moved toward the portrait hole, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Weasley. The castle staff have decided to allow the portrait network to continue singing carols through the weekend. The paintings haven't been this happy in years, and after everything this castle has been through, I believe we can permit a little extra joy." She swept out through the portrait hole, her robes billowing behind her, leaving behind 3 stunned students and 1 delighted first year. "Did that actually just happen?" Fred asked the room at large. "We got points," George said, sounding dazed. "And NEWT credit." "And detention," Hermione reminded them, but she was smiling. "Don't forget the detention." "Worth it," the twins said in perfect unison. Emma had turned back to the snowflake, her expression hopeful. "Do you think it might sing again?" she asked quietly. As if in answer, the snowflake began to glow with soft blue light. Everyone fell silent, watching as it slowly began to rotate on its perch. Then, gentle and clear and impossibly sweet, it began to sing. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Hermione had abandoned her notes to simply listen. The twins stood shoulder to shoulder, proud and humbled all at once by what they'd created. The snowflake sang the entire carol, every verse, its voice filling the empty common room with warmth and memory and love. When it finished, it settled back into stillness, but its glow remained, softer now, but persistent. "Thank you," Emma whispered, and whether she was talking to the twins, or the snowflake, or her absent grandmother, nobody asked. Outside, through the common room windows, the day was dawning clear and bright. The rain had passed completely, leaving behind a world that looked washed clean and new. And on the mantelpiece of Gryffindor Tower, a single snowflake kept watch, sustained by joy and memory and magic that had learned to last just a little bit longer. By lunchtime, the entire school knew about the persistent snowflake in Gryffindor Tower. The portrait network, which functioned as Hogwarts' most efficient communication system, far surpassing any owl post or enchanted notice board, had spread the word throughout the castle. Students from other houses began appearing at the fat lady's portrait, requesting entry to see the miracle snowflake for themselves. The fat lady was having the time of her painted life, playing gatekeeper with theatrical flair. "Password required," she would announce dramatically. "No password, no entry. This isn't a public exhibition, you know. Though between you and me," she would add in a stage whisper that carried perfectly well to everyone within earshot, "it really is quite extraordinary. Sang in the bleak midwinter this morning. Absolutely beautiful. Brought tears to my painted eyes. Well, they would have been tears if I had tear ducts. You understand." Inside the common room, a steady stream of Gryffindors cycled through between classes, checking on the snowflake, making sure it was still there, still singing occasionally, still defying magical logic by continuing to exist. The mantelpiece had become something of a shrine, with students leaving small offerings, a sprig of holly from herbology class, a handful of sugar quills, a drawing of the snowflake sketched by a second year with artistic ambitions. Emma Whitmore had been late to 3 classes because she kept returning to the common room to sit with the snowflake. After the 3rd time, McGonagall had quietly arranged for her to have a special permission slip allowing her to visit during study periods, with the stipulation that her actual studies didn't suffer. The first year had clutched the signed parchment like it was made of gold. By evening, the common room was packed. Students had abandoned the library, the great hall, even the grounds, despite the clear weather that had followed the previous night's rain, to gather in Gryffindor Tower. They'd brought homework, books, chess sets, and gobstones, turning the space into an impromptu social center that hummed with quiet conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. The snowflakes sang periodically throughout the day, never the same carol twice. It had performed O Holy Night for a group of third years, the first Noel for some fifth years who were supposed to be studying for OWLs, and Good King Wenceslas for Ron, who'd asked politely if it knew any songs about food. It didn't, but it sang anyway, and Ron had decided that was good enough. Fred and George had spent the afternoon in the library, much to Madame Pince's visible shock, actually working on the documentation McGonagall had required. They'd filled several rolls of parchment with spell diagrams, ingredient lists, charm sequences, and detailed explanations of their development process. Hermione had offered to help approximately 17 times and been politely declined each time, though she was allowed to proofread for spelling errors. "This is bizarre," Ron said, watching his brothers actually work on a school assignment with something approaching enthusiasm. "Since when do you two care about documentation?" "Since McGonagall offered NEWT credit," George said practically, not looking up from his diagram of the temporal dissolution matrix. "And since we realized we might actually want to remember how we did this," Fred added, carefully labeling a sketch of the crystalline structure they designed. "If we ever want to recreate it, or improve it, or sell it," Hermione suggested archly. "We would never commercialize our art," Fred said with exaggerated dignity. "At least, not until we finish school," George amended. "And possibly not even then," Fred added. "Some magic should stay special." By dinner time, students were bringing food back to the common room rather than eating in the Great Hall, unwilling to miss anything if the snowflake decided to sing again. House elves had appeared, startling several first years who'd never seen them materialize in the common room before, with trays of sandwiches, pitchers of pumpkin juice, and even some biscuits, apparently deciding that if the students were going to camp out in Gryffindor Tower, they should at least be fed properly. The atmosphere had shifted from the chaotic excitement of the previous night to something gentler, more contemplative. Students sat in small clusters, talking quietly, occasionally falling silent when the snowflake glowed in preparation for another song. The younger students had claimed the area closest to the fireplace, sitting on cushions and rugs, some leaning against each other like puppies in a pile. Katie Bell had brought her guitar, a Muggle instrument her father had taught her to play, and was picking out soft melodies between the snowflakes' performances. When the snowflake sang Silent Night, she accompanied it, and the combination of magical and mundane music created something that made several students openly cry. The portraits were in rare form. Tobias McGregor had been joined in his frame by 3 other former headmasters who'd walked over from their official portraits in the actual headmaster's office specifically to witness the persistent snowflake. They were arguing good-naturedly about the magical theory involved, occasionally asking the twins questions about their spell construction, offering suggestions for future improvements. "You should consider adding a memory component," one former headmistress suggested. Link the carol to the listener's happiest Christmas memory. Personalized magic, you see. Much more powerful emotional resonance. That's incredibly advanced magic, Hermione said, looking up from her position near the twins. She'd abandoned all pretense of independence and was now actively contributing to their documentation, having been officially invited to co-author after her 15th helpful suggestion. Memory charms combined with emotional resonance and audio enchantments, that's approaching legilimency-adjacent spellwork. You say that like it's impossible, Fred said, making a note on his parchment. I say it like it's 7th year charms mastery level, Hermione corrected. Which it is. You'd need at least 3 more years of study before attempting something that complex. Challenge accepted, George said, grinning. Nearly headless Nick floated through the wall around 8 o'clock, followed by, surprisingly, the Grey Lady, Ravenclaw's ghost, and the fat friar from Hufflepuff. Even the Bloody Baron made a brief, ominous appearance, his chains clanking as he drifted through to examine the snowflake with what might have been approval, though it was difficult to tell through all the bloodstains and general menacing aura. The other houses are jealous, the fat friar announced cheerfully, his jolly face beaming. The Hufflepuffs especially. They're wondering why Gryffindor gets all the fun magic. Because Gryffindors do reckless things at midnight and somehow don't blow themselves up, the Grey Lady said dryly, though her tone held a hint of amusement. Ravenclaws would still be in the planning stages, and Slytherins would be trying to figure out how to monetize it. Hey, a 7th year Gryffindor with Slytherin friends protested. That's not fair. The Slytherins would absolutely have figured out how to monetize it by now and would be taking pre-orders. The Grey Lady's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Point taken. As the evening wore on, the common room began to feel less like a public space and more like a family gathering. Students who normally kept to their year groups mingled freely. 7th years helped 1st years with homework. 3rd years challenged 5th years to chess matches. 2nd years sat with 6th years, listening to stories about previous years at Hogwarts, about pranks and adventures and narrow escapes from detention. The twins found themselves at the center of attention, but not in their usual loud, performative way. Students kept approaching them quietly, saying thank you, sharing what the snowflakes had meant to them. A 7th year admitted she'd been feeling homesick, but the carols had helped. A 4th year said his little sister had died 2 years ago, and her favorite carol had been Angels We Have Heard on High, and hearing it last night had felt like receiving a message from her. A 6th year simply hugged George and walked away without saying anything, tears streaming down her face. I didn't realize, Fred said quietly to his twin after the 6th year left. I didn't realize it would mean this much to people. Neither did I, George admitted. We just wanted to make people laugh. We did that, Fred said, but we also did more. Hermione, who'd been listening, set down her quill. That's what the best magic does, she said softly. It gives people something they didn't know they needed. Joy, yes, but also connection, memory, hope. You created all of that with singing snow. The twins were silent for a moment, processing this. Then Fred cleared his throat awkwardly. Right, well, can't let it go to our heads. Still have 6 pages of documentation to finish. And McGonagall's detention to serve, George added. Speaking of which, Hermione said. I think detention cleaning transfiguration cupboards might actually be punishment this time, since you're both getting NEWT credit and house points. That is an excellent point, Fred said. We should probably mess up the cupboards before we clean them, George suggested, to make it feel more like proper detention. Please don't, Hermione said wearily. As 9 o'clock approached, students began reluctantly heading to their dormitories, knowing that another late night would result in actual consequences from McGonagall. The younger students were ushered upstairs by prefects, many of them casting longing looks back at the snowflake, not wanting to miss anything. Emma Whitmore was the last first year to leave, having negotiated 5 more minutes, approximately 4 times. When she finally headed up the girls' staircase, she turned back at the landing and whispered, "Good night, Snowflake. Thank you for staying." The snowflake pulsed with light in response, as though acknowledging her words. By 10 o'clock, only a dedicated core group remained, the twins working on their documentation, Hermione helping, despite insisting she was just quality checking, Ron refusing to abandon his brothers despite being unable to contribute anything useful, Dean still sketching, Katie with her guitar, and a handful of older students who'd staked out the best chairs and showed no signs of moving. The portraits had mostly dozed off, though Tobias McGregor remained awake, occasionally offering commentary on the twins' spell diagrams. Nearly headless Nick had departed to do his nightly rounds, promising to return if anything interesting happened. The common room had settled into comfortable quiet, the kind that came from shared purpose and easy companionship. The fire burned steadily. The windows showed stars outside, visible now that the rain had passed. And on the mantelpiece, the snowflake glowed softly, a constant presence that had somehow become the heart of Gryffindor Tower. "Question," Ron said, breaking the silence. "What happens when it actually does melt? I mean, it has to eventually, right? Magic can't last forever." "Nothing lasts forever," George said, not looking up from his parchment. "That was the whole point. Beauty in impermanence. But people are going to be devastated when it's gone," Katie said, setting down her guitar. "Especially the younger students. Emma's going to cry for days." "Maybe that's important too," Hermione said thoughtfully. "Learning that beautiful things can end, and that doesn't diminish what they were while they lasted. That's a valuable lesson." "Very philosophical, Hermione," Fred said. "Did you get that from a book?" "I got it from watching you two create temporary magic and somehow make it matter more because it was temporary," Hermione said. "That was the brilliance of it, making something that wouldn't last, that couldn't be kept or collected or owned, just experienced and remembered." The twins exchanged glances, and something passed between them that the others couldn't quite read. "We might have one more surprise," Fred said carefully. "Might," George emphasized. "It's experimental, more experimental than the original snowflakes." "Which is saying something," Fred added. Hermione's eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" "We didn't do anything yet," George said. "But we've been thinking. What if we created one more snowflake, one final one? But instead of a Christmas carol, it sings something else. Something original," Fred continued. "A song about this, about the magic, the joy, the temporary nature of it all, about Hogwarts and home and the feeling of being somewhere you belong." "You wrote a song?" Ron asked, sounding stunned. "When?" You've been working on documentation all day. Last night, George admitted. After everyone went to bed, we couldn't sleep. Too much adrenaline, too much everything. So we wrote lyrics. And this morning, during a free period, we worked out the melody, Fred said. Katie helped, actually. We hummed it for her in the library, and she helped us structure it properly. Katie nodded confirmation. It's beautiful, she said simply. Genuinely beautiful. If they can actually enchant it into a snowflake, it'll be something special. But here's the thing, George said, setting down his quill and finally looking at the group. We can only make one. The magic required: original composition, emotional resonance, personalized enchantment. It's going to take everything we've got, both of us working together. And once we create it, we won't be able to recreate it. The magic will be spent. Like a phoenix, Hermione breathed. One-time magic that burns itself out in the casting. Exactly like that, Fred confirmed. So we need to decide. Do we make it? Do we create one final snowflake that will sing one original song and then melt, knowing we can never do it again? The common room fell silent. The students looked at each other, then at the persistent snowflake on the mantelpiece, then back at the twins. Yes, Dean said quietly. Absolutely yes. Without question, Katie agreed. If you don't do it, I'll never forgive you, Ron said. Hermione nodded. Some magic should be once in a lifetime. This sounds like exactly that kind of magic. The twins stood. Fred retrieved their bag, the same one that had held 63 vials the previous night, and pulled out a single new vial. This one was different, larger, made of crystal rather than glass, and empty, waiting to hold whatever magic they were about to create. We'll need complete silence, George said. This is going to require total concentration. And probably look completely ridiculous, Fred added. Fair warning. The students arranged themselves around the common room's perimeter, giving the twins space near the fireplace. They stood facing each other, wands raised, the crystal vial floating between them at chest height. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then they began to cast. The spell work was unlike anything the watching students had seen before. Instead of clear incantations, the twins seemed to be humming, creating the melody they'd composed, building it in layers, each hum adding complexity and depth. Their wands moved in mirror patterns, tracing shapes in the air that glowed softly and hung suspended like musical notes made visible. Above the vial, moisture began to condense from the air itself. Water droplets formed, clustering together, beginning to freeze in patterns that were clearly deliberate. The snowflake was being built note by note, each crystalline structure corresponding to a musical phrase, the entire thing a physical manifestation of sound and emotion made solid. The twins' eyes were closed, their faces showing intense concentration. Sweat beaded on Fred's forehead. George's wand hand trembled slightly from the magical exertion. But they didn't stop, didn't falter. The humming continued, building to something that felt almost like a crescendo. The snowflake completed itself in a sudden rush, crystal structures locking into place, the entire thing beginning to glow with a light that cycled through colors, blue to silver to gold to something that looked almost like captured starlight. It hung in the air for a moment, suspended between the twins, rotating slowly. Then it descended into the waiting vial. The twins lowered their wands simultaneously, both breathing hard. Fred swayed slightly, and Ron rushed forward to steady him. George caught himself on the mantelpiece, his hand landing just inches from the original persistent snowflake. That, George gasped, was significantly harder than the original spell work. Worth it, though, Fred managed. Ron, is the room supposed to be spinning? No, Ron said. You should sit down, both of you. Hermione, get them some water or something. Hermione was already moving, conjuring glasses and filling them with aguamenti. The twins drank gratefully, colour slowly returning to their faces. The watching students remained silent, awed by what they'd just witnessed. In its crystal vial, the new snowflake glowed and pulsed with inner light. It was larger than the original snowflakes, more complex in structure, and it radiated magic in a way that was almost tangible. The air around the vial seemed to shimmer with potential. When do we release it? Dean asked quietly. Fred and George looked at each other, then at the persistent snowflake on the mantelpiece, then at the crystal vial containing their final creation. Tomorrow evening, Fred decided, give everyone a chance to be here, to say goodbye properly. Because once we release this one, George said, once it sings its song and melts, that's it. The magic of the singing snow will be over. The original snowflake will melt too. We designed them to be connected. When the last one dies, the first one goes with it. Like bookends, Hermione said softly. The first and the last, marking the beginning and end of something beautiful. Exactly, Fred said. The twins carefully set the crystal vial on the mantelpiece beside the original snowflake. The two enchantments seemed to recognize each other, their glows synchronized, pulsing in time like matching heartbeats. Tomorrow evening, George repeated, we'll tell everyone. Give them time to prepare. To say goodbye, Fred added. And on the mantelpiece, bathed in firelight and starlight and magic that had learned to last just a little longer than it should, two snowflakes kept watch over Gryffindor Tower, one that had been and one that would be, the beginning and the ending, waiting together for their final song. Word spread through Hogwarts like wildfire, the way news always did when it involved magic that was genuinely extraordinary. By breakfast the next morning, every student in the castle knew that the Weasley twins were releasing one final snowflake that evening, a farewell performance that would mark the end of the singing snow magic forever. The great hall buzzed with speculation over porridge and pumpkin juice. Students from other houses approached the Gryffindor table with requests to attend, offers to trade favors for access, even outright pleas. The twins had to repeatedly explain that they couldn't control who was in the Gryffindor common room, but that the portraits would likely carry the sound throughout the castle anyway, so everyone would hear it regardless of location. It won't be the same, though, a Ravenclaw fifth year insisted, her voice carrying that peculiar intensity that came from someone who desperately didn't want to miss out. Hearing it through portraits versus being there, experiencing it, those are completely different things. Talk to your house ghosts, George suggested diplomatically. Maybe they can arrange something. By mid-morning, an impromptu delegation had formed, representatives from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and even Slytherin, all making formal requests to their respective heads of house for permission to visit Gryffindor Tower that evening. The castle staff, apparently having decided that fostering inter-house unity was worth bending a few rules, granted permission to small groups from each house, provided they were accompanied by prefects and behaved with appropriate decorum. Professor McGonagall made an announcement at lunch, her voice magically amplified to reach every corner of the Great Hall. This evening, at 7 o'clock, students from all houses who wished to witness the final performance of the Enchanted Snow may gather in the entrance hall. Prefects will escort you to Gryffindor Tower in an orderly fashion. Capacity is limited. First come, first served. Anyone causing disruption will be immediately escorted back to their common room and barred from future inter-house visits for the remainder of term. The statement was met with a roar of approval that McGonagall silenced with a single, sharp look. Furthermore, she continued, her Scottish accent cutting clearly through the returned quiet, I expect this evening to serve as an example of what Hogwarts can be when houses work together in pursuit of shared joy rather than competitive rivalry. Do not disappoint me. She sat down, her point made, and the Great Hall immediately erupted into excited conversation. Fred and George, sitting at the Gryffindor table, exchanged slightly panicked glances. We've created a thing, Fred said. A proper thing, George agreed. An inter-house, staff-approved, potentially legendary thing, Fred continued. And if the snowflake doesn't work, or melts too quickly, or, George began. Don't, Hermione interrupted firmly from across the table. Don't spiral into worst-case scenarios. The magic worked perfectly when you created it. It'll work perfectly tonight. Trust your skill. Hermione's right, Ron said, through a mouthful of shepherd's pie. You two are brilliant at magic, even if most of it's technically against school rules. This'll be great. Probably. Almost definitely. Very reassuring, Ron. Fred said dryly. I try, Ron said, completely missing the sarcasm. The day passed in a strange state of suspended anticipation. Classes continued. Transfiguration, charms, defense against the dark arts. But professors seemed to recognize that students' attention was elsewhere and adjusted accordingly. More than one lesson ended early, teachers simply giving up on maintaining focus when half the class kept glancing at the windows, watching the sun move across the sky, counting down hours until evening. In Gryffindor Tower, preparations were underway. The common room had been cleaned thoroughly by eager first and second years who'd volunteered for the task, treating it like a sacred duty. Furniture had been rearranged to maximize space, chairs and sofas pushed to the perimeter, the center left open, all sidelines directed toward the mantelpiece where two snowflakes now sat side by side, glowing softly in anticipation. Emma Whitmore had spent most of her free period sitting cross-legged before the fireplace, talking quietly to the original snowflake. Nobody questioned this or found it strange. After 2 days of the snowflake's presence, students had developed their own relationships with the magic, their own ways of saying goodbye. Dean had completed a full series of sketches, the snowflake from every angle, in every light, capturing not just its physical form, but somehow the feeling of it, the weight of the joy it had created. He'd made copies using a careful duplication charm and was distributing them to anyone who asked, creating a record that would outlast the magic itself. Katie Bell had written down the melody the twins had composed, translating their hummed creation into actual musical notation with Hermione's help. She'd made copies of that too, preserving the song in a form that could be played long after the enchanted snowflake had melted. By 6 o'clock, Gryffindor Tower was packed with its own students. Everyone having returned early from dinner or skipped it entirely, too nervous with anticipation to eat. The portraits were all awake and positioned in their frames like audience members at a theatre, some having invited painted friends from other corridors to squeeze into their frames for a better view. Tobias McGregor had claimed his usual spot above the mantelpiece, flanked by 3 other former headmasters whose portraits normally hung in the actual headmaster's office. They were dressed in their finest painted robes, treating the occasion with the gravitas of a formal ceremony. In 300 years, McGregor kept saying to anyone who would listen, I have never seen magic like this. Never. And I was here when Wendelin the Weird got herself burned 47 times for fun. This is more remarkable than that, and that involved actual fire. At 7:15, McGonagall herself arrived through the portrait hole, accompanied by Professor Flitwick, who'd apparently heard about the evening's events and asked to attend. Both professors wore expressions of professional interest, though McGonagall's eyes moved immediately to the mantelpiece, to the 2 snowflakes waiting there, and something in her stern face softened. Mrs. Weasley, she acknowledged with a nod. Professor Flitwick wished to observe your final performance. I trust you have no objections. Of course not, Professor, the twins said together, looking simultaneously nervous and pleased that their charms professor had come. Flitwick beamed up at them. He was exceptionally short, even for a professor, and his enthusiasm was infectious. I've been hearing extraordinary things about your spell work, boys. Absolutely extraordinary. 7-layered charms, sympathetic harmonics, emotional resonance. Why, this could be published in Practical Enchanting. Have you considered submitting to journals? We've mostly been trying not to blow anything up, Fred admitted. A worthy goal, Flitwick said seriously. Often undervalued in creative magic. But really, this work could advance the entire field of aesthetic enchantment. At 7 o'clock precisely, the portrait hole opened, and students from other houses began filing in, escorted by their prefects as promised. Hufflepuffs entered first, a group of about 15, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. They were followed by Ravenclaws, who immediately began asking technical questions about the magic that the twins politely deflected. Even a small group of Slytherins appeared, looking slightly uncomfortable about being in Gryffindor Tower, but too intrigued to let house rivalry keep them away. The ghosts arrived as a collective, nearly headless Nick, leading the way, followed by the Fat Friar, the Grey Lady, and, most surprisingly, the Bloody Baron, whose chains made ominous clanking sounds that several first-years found terrifying. Even Moaning Myrtle had apparently heard about the evening and floated up from the second-floor bathroom, though she stayed near the ceiling, away from the crowds she typically avoided. Within 15 minutes, the common room was packed beyond what should have been physically possible. Students sat on every available surface, stood in corners, perched on stair railings. The ghosts floated in layers above the crowd, creating translucent tiers of spectators. The portraits were 3 deep with painted figures, some standing on painted furniture in their frames to see over others' heads. Fred and George stood near the fireplace, the crystal vial containing the final snowflake held carefully between them. They looked around at the assembled crowd. Hundreds of students, multiple professors, ghosts spanning centuries, portraits containing figures from throughout Hogwarts history. and the weight of what they'd created seemed to settle on them fully for the first time. "Right," Fred said, his voice carrying in the expectant silence. "So, this is a bit more than we expected." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. "We created the singing snowflakes as a prank," George continued. "Just a bit of fun. Something to make people laugh on a rainy night." "But they became more than that," Fred said. "They became about memory, about joy, about the temporary nature of beautiful things and how that temporariness makes them more precious, not less." "This final snowflake," George said, lifting the crystal vial slightly, "contains a song we wrote about Hogwarts, about home, about the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than yourself. About magic that matters," Fred said quietly. "Not because it's powerful or dangerous or useful, but because it reminds us why we love magic in the first place, because it makes us feel something. When we release this snowflake," George continued, "it will sing once, the whole song, and then it will melt. And when it melts, the original snowflake, the one that's been sitting on the mantelpiece, refusing to dissolve, sustained by everyone's joy, will melt too. The magic will be complete, finished, gone." "So this is goodbye," Fred said, "to singing snow, to Christmas carols in November, to magic that was never meant to last, but somehow did anyway, just a little longer than it should have." Emma Whitmore, sitting closest to the fireplace, raised her hand tentatively. "Will we ever get to experience it again? The snowflakes?" The twins exchanged glances, and Fred shook his head gently. "We could recreate the original spellwork, probably, make more caroling snow, but it wouldn't be the same. The magic of these particular snowflakes, the specific conditions that created them, the emotional resonance that sustained them, that can't be replicated. It could only happen once." "Then we're lucky we were here for it," Emma said simply. "Yes," George agreed. "You were. We all were." He looked at his twin, and they nodded in unison. Together, they raised their wands and opened the crystal vial. The final snowflake emerged slowly, majestically, rising from its container like a star being born. It was immediately clear that this snowflake was different from all the others. Larger, yes, but also more complex. Its crystalline structure seemed to contain layers upon layers of geometric patterns, each one catching the firelight differently. And the colors, it cycled through every shade imaginable, from deep winter blue to warm golden light to something that looked like captured moonlight. It rose to the center of the common room, to the exact point where dozens of snowflakes had hung 2 nights before. And there it stopped, rotating gently, pulsing with inner light. Every eye in the room was fixed on it. Every breath was held. Then it began to sing. The voice wasn't like the carol snowflakes had been, sweet and clear but ultimately familiar, singing songs everyone knew. This voice was unique, layered, containing harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single source. And the song itself was unlike anything the assembled students had heard before. In halls of stone where magic dwells, where portraits speak and staircases deceive, we find the home our hearts remember, the place where we can dare to believe. The lyrics spoke of Hogwarts, of specific corridors and classrooms, of the great hall's enchanted ceiling, of Quidditch pitches and forbidden forest edges. But they also spoke of something deeper, of finding your place, of discovering that home wasn't always where you were born, but sometimes where you grew into yourself. 4 houses divided, 1 castle shared. Our differences the threads that make us strong. In courage, loyalty, wit, and ambition, we find the place where we belong. Students from all 4 houses were represented in those lines. Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, all acknowledged, all valued, all necessary parts of the greater whole. Several Slytherins looked genuinely moved. It wasn't often that their house was celebrated alongside the others without qualification or suspicion. The magic here is more than spells, more than wands and ancient texts. It's in the friendships forged in firelight, the memories we'll carry next. Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling. Half the first years were crying. A quarter of the older students too, though many were trying to hide it. Even McGonagall's eyes looked suspiciously bright. So when we leave these hallowed halls, when stone and spell must fade away, we'll carry Hogwarts in our hearts, the home that will forever stay. The snowflakes' glow intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at directly. The final verse rang out, filling every corner of Gryffindor Tower, echoing through portrait frames into corridors beyond, reaching throughout the castle. For magic ends, and beauty fades, and nothing gold can always stay, but love and joy and hope remain, long after wonder melts away. The last note hung in the air, sustained impossibly long, seeming to resonate in the stones themselves. Then gently, inevitably, the snowflake began to fall. It descended slowly, giving everyone time to watch, to memorize, to hold this moment as long as they could. As it fell, it began to dissolve, not melting exactly, but becoming light, becoming air, becoming something intangible that couldn't be held but could be remembered. It reached the mantelpiece, touched the stone, and dissolved completely into sparkles that hung in the air like suspended stars. And there, beside where it had landed, the original snowflake, the one that had persisted for 2 days, sustained by joy and memory and collective love, began to melt as well. Emma reached out instinctively, wanting to catch it, to save it somehow. But the snowflake was already water, already gone, leaving behind only dampness and the sharp, lingering sense of something precious having existed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The common room was silent, except for quiet sniffling from multiple corners. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It was Flitwick, his small hands creating a surprisingly loud sound in the silence. McGonagall joined him, then the students, first the Gryffindors, then the other houses, then everyone, until the common room thundered with applause that felt less like appreciation for a performance and more like gratitude for a gift. The twins stood near the fireplace, looking overwhelmed and humbled and proud all at once. Students surged forward, not chaotically, but deliberately, wanting to say something, to express what the magic had meant. There were handshakes and hugs, and more than a few tears. Emma hugged them both fiercely, despite being at least a foot shorter than either twin. "Thank you," she whispered. "My Gran would have loved this, all of it." "So would our mum," Fred said quietly, even though she'd probably yell at us for doing magic this advanced without supervision. "She's going to read about this in the Prophet eventually," George said. "There's no way this doesn't make the papers." "We're so grounded," Fred agreed, but he was smiling. The professors approached last. Flitwick was practically bouncing with excitement, already discussing the possibilities for academic publication, for advancing the field of aesthetic enchantment, for recognition from the Council of Magical Arts. McGonagall simply looked at her two troublesome, brilliant students and said, "Well done. Truly well done." Coming from McGonagall, it was worth more than any award. As the evening wound down and students from other houses began their escorted returns to their own towers and common rooms, the Gryffindors remained, settling back into their space now that it was theirs again. The common room felt different somehow, not emptier exactly, but changed. The magic was gone, but what it had created remained. Dean's sketches would hang in the common room for years. Katie's written melody would be played at house gatherings, sung quietly by students who remembered or who learned from those who'd been there. The story would be told and retold, passed down through years of students, becoming legend. Fred and George sat in front of the fireplace, exhausted but content. The documentation was complete, submitted to McGonagall that afternoon. Their detention was scheduled for next week. Their names would be remembered not just for pranks and chaos, but for creating something genuinely beautiful. "No regrets?" George asked his twin. "None," Fred said immediately. "You?" "Not one." On the mantelpiece, where two snowflakes had sat for one perfect day, there was nothing now but dampness slowly drying and a few sparkles that caught the firelight. But in the memories of everyone who'd been there, in their hearts, in their stories, in the way they'd carry this experience forward, the magic remained. The portraits began to sing as midnight approached. Not magically, just with their painted voices, rough and off-key but enthusiastic. They sang the original carols from that first chaotic night, and they sang the twins' original song, getting the words wrong more often than right, but filling the tower with music regardless. Outside, snow began to fall, real snow this time, the first of the season, coming early to Scotland. It fell on Hogwarts towers and turrets, on the grounds and the forbidden forest, on the lake and the Quidditch pitch. Silent snow, beautiful snow, snow that would melt when morning came. But for tonight, it fell like a blessing, like an answer, like the castle itself saying thank you to two students who'd reminded everyone what magic could be when it came from joy instead of necessity. In Gryffindor Tower, the fire burned low. Students headed to bed, reluctant but satisfied. The twins remained by the hearth, watching the snow fall outside, remembering the singing snowflakes, already thinking about what they might create next. Some magic ended, some beauty faded, but love and joy and hope remained, long after wonder melted away. And in a castle full of magic, on a night when snow fell silent and beautiful, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.